24. It was when Dan, Theresa, and his mother were occupied in the bedroom that Dmitri discovered the hatch in the second-floor ceiling. It wasn't too far from the top of the staircase. Dmitri slowly and discreetly pulled it down, and then slowly and discreetly unfolded the staircase attached to it. He climbed quietly inside and quickly shut the hatch behind him. It was dark inside the attic, and the smell was musty in its suffocating heat. Dmitri retrieved from his person a small flashlight no longer or wider than that of a pen. It wasn't very bright, but it was enough to illuminate his path, and it was enough to investigate. Dmitri noted that the attic seemed relatively scarce compared with the hoarding habits of his own mother and household. There were a few things, like the remnants of Dan's mother and her passion for sewing. There was a large chest that gave the impression that it might contain some pirate's booty, but upon picking the lock, Dmitri discovered only rags of clothing. There were boxes, quite a few boxes. Nothing screamed valuables until Dmitri discovered it. It was hidden poorly behind a few of these cardboard boxes. It was a combination safe. It was old, so Dmitri knew that if he tried hard enough, he could cheat it. He got on all fours and put his ear close to the lock and slowly began to turn for the right combination. He had decided that whatever was in there would be his and his alone. He would not share the contents with his mother or brother. Why should he? They would do just fine with the usual stereo, DVD player, or whatever else they could manage to hawk on eBay. Before Bartholomew awoke from his dark slumber, he was haunted by a strong vision of himself. It was the last sight he had seen standing in front of that bathroom mirror before he had passed out, or away, as he liked to call it. He was able to see what he had written in lipstick on the mirror, though he didn't quite know what the expression could possibly mean. He found that during these little spells of his, in which he was possessed by the gnomes, he often acted in ways which were very much beyond himself. As his eyes opened and he found himself staring at the ceiling, he made efforts to quickly get to his feet. He took another look in the mirror. The words written now were as clearly as they were in his unconscious vision. "Here stands the loneliest man on earth." Bartholomew tried not to let the words touch him, but they did with brutal honesty. His face sank like wet clothes worn on a slender frame. He heard talking outside in the hall. People were approaching, and he had no time to clean the lipstick mess he had made. Panic set in. He squeezed himself out of the door ajar, just as Theresa was managing to pull Dan away from the bedroom entrance. She looked at him and nodded a greeting in a slightly timid fashion before heading down the stairs with her boyfriend. Bartholomew waited a moment after they had passed before joining his mother in the bedroom. When he entered, she was searching the room carefully. "Her fiancé," said Diane. "She said he was her fiancé, but I didn't see any ring on her. Did you?" "No," replied Bartholomew. "That must mean that she has taken the ring off, so it's got to be around here somewhere. Where were you?" "I was in the bathroom," said Bartholomew. "Oh, perfect, of course. She had probably taken it off there so it wouldn't slip down the drain or something." Diane headed for the hallway, but Bartholomew stopped her, trying not to raise her suspicions. "I didn't see anything," said Bartholomew. Diane was quick to pick up on her son's odd behavior. "Honestly, I'm not going to take it now. I just wanted to know where she keeps it." She looked at him again and saw that his behavior did not alter in the face of her honesty. It must have been something else. "Will you relax?" she said quietly. "We're going to be fine. They might suspect us, but they'll never be able to prove a thing because our prince will already have been present in the house before the crime scene. We've been over this." "I just don't like it," he said. He looked down, away from his mother. Diane rolled her eyes and put a hand on her son's cheek. "Oh," she cooed, "you're always such a sensitive thing." She smiled lovingly. "And that's why I love you." She gave her son a peck on the cheek. Again she tried to pass him. "It's not there," said Bartholomew sternly. "All right, fine," said Diane, backing off. She went back to the searching of the bedroom. "Then it still must be here somewhere. I would check by the kitchen sink, but I saw that they have a dishwasher and very little pots and pans. I doubt very much she does a lot of cooking. She's young. They probably eat out 5 times a week. Dmitri sat on the attic floor, Indian style. He held his tiny flashlight like it was the tool of a surgeon above his head and pointed down as he read the documents he retrieved from the safe. He was riveted. He had found something that he believed to be more valuable than any piece of gold or jewelry. He had found secrets, ancient and old, amongst the clutter of old books and documents, some much newer than others. There was a confession. It was when the 3 strangers had left their home that Theresa and Dan finally felt at peace. It was a new kind of peace. It cleared their minds. They were not thinking. Dan felt more in love with Theresa than he had ever before, and he felt himself claim that love as natural. It was always like this, and it was always going to be like this. His was a natural love now. As they ventured up the stairs to the bedroom, Dan thought that now would be as good a time as any to present to her the ring that he had purchased for her in secret. He had hid it carefully in the bedroom so that she might have never found it. Dan began to think that perhaps he was hiding it more from himself than Theresa. Kind of an out-of-sight, out-of-mind approach to the matter, the cherry on top of his already defensive manner. Things seemed and appeared to be resolved. They entered the room with a new confidence. Theresa began to undress by the bed as Dan discreetly headed for his sock drawer. Theresa now stood in her leather. "Should I take this off?" she asked. "Yes," said Dan, but he wasn't looking at her. He was distracted. The engagement ring was gone. When he finally did glance over, Theresa was smiling. She was examining herself in the leather one last time. If Diane had been in the room at that moment, Dan would have suspected her of taking the ring. But she wasn't, and all he could see was his girlfriend, standing there, smiling. She must have found it, thought Dan. Theresa began the arduous process of removing her leather when Dan started. "No," he said abruptly. "Leave it." He was angry. He wanted to yell and scream at Theresa, but he didn't. He choked down all of his rageful feelings and took his shirt off to get ready for bed. He crawled into bed with her and turned out the light. Theresa was expecting to make love with Dan and was both puzzled and hurt by his sudden mood swing. That night, in the cool late hours of the moon's rain that congealed softness, the door to Dan and Theresa's bedroom slowly crept open. The fingers had emerged. They wore black robes from their heads down to their feet. There were 5 of them, and they worked with purpose. They gathered around Dan and Theresa's bed and crouched down low to take a look underneath. One of them, who would quickly become apparent to be the leader, actually removed his hood, revealing an elder gentleman with a healthy complexion and a thin rim of white hair that surrounded the back of his head. His name was Dr. Peter Francis, and given his mysterious nature, it would have been difficult to determine his precise presence here on earth in years. Though he looked to be no older than 60, it was within those deep blue eyes in which one could see centuries. Francis looked under the bed and immediately spotted the beast to be huddled in the far corner like a frightened animal. "Yup," Francis said. "It appears to be fully grown now." One of the other cloaked men handed Francis a small wooden box from which he retrieved an antique stethoscope. Francis kindly extended his hand to the beast, and the beast reluctantly reciprocated. Francis took the monster's pulse at its wrist. "Never ask them for a name," said Francis to the others. "It gives them power." Upon hearing this, the beast snarled a little. "No, call it a monster," said Francis with a sigh. "And if you must, the boogeyman." Francis gave a careful once-over at the monster's appearance and nodded. "This one here appears to have been raised well," he said. And the hosts, the lovers? Asked one of the others. Are they asleep now? Yes, said Francis. He briefly looked up at Dan and Theresa from his low vantage. They are dreaming. They're dreaming of what? Asked the monster knowingly. It had surprised Francis and the others to suddenly hear the beast pipe up. Francis put his finger over his lips. Shh, he said. You'll wake them. "26. Dmitri and Bart sat along the rocky banks of the Saco River. The moonlight was a polished blue gold. It glistened across the subtle wake of the cool black water like starshine. They heard the van door shut from the dusty parking lot and knew Diane was approaching. Dmitri had lit a Cuban cigar and he smoked it, enjoying every moment of its sensuous smoke. Off in the distance, about a couple of acres away, they heard kids drinking by a campfire and tossing beer cans at rocks. Diane came up behind Dmitri and gave him a casual kick in the back with her knee-high brown leather boots. "What are you smoking?" she asked. "It's a Freudian cock," said Dmitri sarcastically. Diane scoffed and rolled her eyes. "You hear that?" she said, after a moment. The kids in the distance seemed louder with the laughter. Some hilarious incident must have just happened. "Yeah," said Bart. "That's the perfect alibi," said Diane. "Drinking with teenagers is going to be our alibi?" asked Dmitri, making no effort to disguise skepticism. Diane exhaled a youthful breath of happiness and relief. "It's perfect," she said. "I'll make a lasting impression." She shot Dmitri a wink and a smile. "The youth have no sense of time. You two stay here, so when I leave them, it'll be like I'm just coming over here. We drive off with no headlights. We hit the house, and we're back before dawn. It's perfect." "You say so," said Dmitri. "Yes," she said, sensing Dmitri's challenging demeanor and putting on her display of dominance with a deliberate glance. "I do." She paused a moment to take in the beauty of the night and her two boys without another word. "God," said Dmitri, as he watched his mother leave. Without her present, it was now safe for him to showcase his admiration for the woman. "It's almost worth the risk of jail time just to have her for a mother." Bartholomew said nothing until Dmitri looked at him suspiciously. "I don't know," said Bart. "When I find a woman, I hope she's nothing like her." Upon hearing this, Dmitri's suspicion turned quickly to scorn. "What kind of bastard are you?" he asked. Bartholomew became, once again, silent. He looked up and across the wide river, barely making out the trees on the far end. Dmitri patted his brother on the back. "I want to show you something," Dmitri finally said, and with that he retrieved a stack of folded papers from the inner pocket of his vest. He handed them to Bart. The papers were old, some were typed, some were handwritten. "What's this?" asked Bart. "I found it in the house tonight," said Dmitri. "In the attic," he added. "You think that place is really haunted?" asked Bart. Dmitri wanted to say, "No, of course not," but he couldn't, so he just kept his mouth shut and puffed from his cigar. In all their years of robbing and cheating, Dmitri and his family had never encountered a house that was truly haunted. But if there ever was a candidate for one, based on the papers Dmitri found, this would be that. "What's in these?" asked Bart, holding up the documents now. "That right there," said Dmitri as he leaned forward to kind of hide his face and point with his cigar. "That right there is some genuine supernatural shit for you." Bart took another stab at perusing the documents in the dark. "And it's just one man's story." Dmitri puffed his cigarette between speaking. "And research. But in essence, it's the story of us all." Diane emerged from the woods and into the lit clearing of teenagers. The crackle of the campfire launched tiny sparks in the air to fade in heat and light. There were 7 kids, 4 girls and 3 guys. They were surprised to lay eyes on Diane, but not horrified. "Hello, boys and girls," she said. They all looked guilty, and this delighted Diane with a tiny amount of glee. The ballsiest of the boys cautiously walked up to her and handed her a beer. She took it and nodded her head with gratitude. "Thank you," she said. This was an enormous relief to the young partiers. They were not busted, but little did they know. Diane proceeded to engage them all in long and interesting tales of mythology. Her biting sense of wit had them smirking at first, and then later, as the night went on, hysterics. It was as if she possessed them effortlessly. They began to do things they might never have expected to do, like dancing around the fire in tow of Diane and chanting to gods they had never heard of. Later, they would tell themselves and each other, and anyone else who would listen for that matter, that they were all so completely wasted, but the truth is they were seduced by the spells of a life they did not think capable of living, a life led by Diane. "27. Sheriff Jack Friedman awoke from his fitful dream, startled. He had fallen asleep in his patrol car. He felt a great unease at the moment, which he attributed to the unsettling dream that resonated in his mind like a chorus of horror. Some of the images were still clear like a photograph or a movie. It was him as a boy, wounded on the ground and looking up at the silhouetted beast that stood tall above him. The great antlers, the snort from its breath, the muscular frame. It was a man with the head of an elk. Jack rubbed his eyes tightly, hoping to expunge his last thoughts on this. He thought of the young couple he had encountered the other night. Where were they now, and were their claims real? When dealing with them, he had successfully ignored that inner feeling in the pit of his stomach that was somehow responsible for them. It was a fatherly instinct. He worried now, though. That feeling returned, or perhaps it was always there, now unable to be suppressed any further. Jack couldn't help but reflect upon that nourished fear he felt in the dream and in that memory. He was alone. He was alone in the forest, and he was confronted by something ancient and strong, something that truly belonged there, not young Jack. But the sheriff belonged there now, and he knew he had to go back to that house. The voice of Sheila suddenly came through on the radio. "Jack," she said, "are you awake?" Jack fumbled for the CB and retrieved it. "Yeah, I'm here. What's up?" "We got a report of some kids partying out by the river. You want to go check it out?" Jack did not want to go check it out. He had made his mind up to go and check in on the house of Dan and Theresa, but he had duties and responsibilities that would have to come first. "Yeah, all right," he said. "I'll get right on it." Jack released his grip on the CB and put it away, back in its place now just below the radio. He sighed like nature sighs at the sight of every natural disaster. His plans had been disrupted. He pulled into the dusty parking lot with an uneventful greeting. It was just the Crown Vic and him and dirt. The scene looked dead. Jack got out of his car and scoped the scene, every nook and cranny. He ventured off into the acres of forest like a hero on a quest. Just what that quest was, or whether or not he was in fact a hero, were questions that did not enter his mind. He only knew he was on a mission and that he had to investigate. It was roaming through those thick-wooded areas that he began to feel like an embodied child. He had been to these sites before, but never with the remnants of a dream like the one he just had, stored somewhere in the back of his mind. He half expected to see some grisly elk man appear to him out of nowhere from behind some bushes. Jack came across the campsite of the young teenagers like some kind of lost archaeologist. They were all sleeping, their closed eyelids telling the stories that no waking man could decipher. They were lined in a circle, and Jack walked that circle with his flashlight in hand. Although it was not needed because the dying embers of the fire were still lit, he made sure to look at every one of them. It was safe. Whatever the concern that caused Sheila to contact him was with the campfire now and dying. The kids were all sleeping and the weekend night was almost over. Jack, as their father, decided to leave, for it seemed like they had all been carefully tucked in for the night. He didn't dare wake them, for they looked like sleeping angels. He felt like an intruder. He didn't mind feeling like an intruder because, as a sheriff, it was his power to intrude, but the divine sight of eyes closed made him unwelcomed in the presence of something greater than himself, something greater than nature. It was the sacred act of rest, that much-needed exploit. Dan awoke to the obvious sound of Theresa whimpering. It wasn't coming from the bedroom, and so Dan identified the whimpering as something more if he could hear it from some other room. It must have been bad. He sat up in bed after checking the companion slot next to him on that great big mattress of theirs. It was empty, and so was his reserve. If Theresa's meltdown wasn't some complete and total catastrophe, Dan was going to be pissed. He was at the end of his rope with all of this, and the little stuff was not needed. Dan got up from the bed, left the room, and entered the hallway. It was quiet, not a soul around, no monsters, no shadows, no claims of this, that, or the other, save for Theresa. Dan entered the bathroom to find Theresa huddled in the corner by the bathtub. She wasn't just whimpering, she was crying. Dan looked at her for a moment. "Theresa," he said, "what is it?" Theresa gave no more response to that question than a simple gesture. She pointed to the bathroom mirror with a trembling hand. "That," she said, stuttering out a proclamation she did not expect Dan to understand. Dan looked to the mirror and saw himself staring back at him. But below, written in lipstick, were the words, "Here stands the loneliest man on earth." Dan saw his reflection and its caption and instantly wanted to explode. He wanted to smash the mirror and destroy everything in sight. But before he could act, Theresa spoke once more. "It's him," cried Theresa. "Who?" asked Dan. "The psychic?" "No," said Theresa. "The man from the grave." "What grave? What are you talking about? Theresa, who did this?" Theresa did not answer. She just screamed out loud. Dan grabbed a washcloth from the sink and began to wipe down the mirror. "I kept the etching from his grave under my mattress, all throughout college, and then one day it was gone. It just disappeared. Now I know. He's the monster. I brought this on us." "I still don't know what you're talking about," muttered Dan under his breath. "Dan, when I was a girl, we would hang out in the graveyard after school, Peter and I." "Peter? Who's Peter?" Dan asked, but his questions fell by the wayside as Theresa continued to speak. "And there was one grave there that read, 'Here lies the loneliest man on earth.' They couldn't have known that, Peter. "Peter," replied Dan. "My name's Dan." They couldn't have known that, Dan. Dan picked Theresa up off the floor and walked her out of the bathroom. "What's happening to you?" Dan asked. "I don't know," whimpered Theresa. They entered the bedroom, and Dan couldn't help but think that Theresa was losing her mind, and that she in fact was the one who wrote the reference to the grave on the mirror. He tried to find the inner strength to be supportive, but her desperate pleas for attention began to wear thin on him. That, and the fact that she had taken her engagement ring without telling him, began to gnaw at Dan's innards like a coyote eating the stomach of some freshly dead prey. They lay in bed together, Theresa in Dan's arms, and Dan thought. From a distance, he thought. His eyes stared up at the ceiling, launching his mind backwards in time to a more simpler era. His father was still alive, and he was just a boy. Victor was a very traditional father. He took pride in many of the things that suburban and rural fathers took pride in, mainly the lawn. That, to Victor, was the essence of a good home and a well-established family. Dan remembered when Victor installed the sprinkler system in their front lawn, and he remembered that on lazy afternoons, when he was really bored, how he liked to watch the sprinklers do their duties and spray and spritz the lawn with water. It was almost hypnotic. At this moment now, Dan wished for those sprinklers to activate, to wash away the scene, to cleanse the area and time. The caravan pulled into the driveway quietly after Diane had switched the headlights back off. Inside, she turned to her boys once more. "Okay, Dmitri, grab the bags in the back." Dmitri leaned over the back of the seat and retrieved the large canvas bags. "Does everybody know what they're after?" asked Diane out loud, though Bartholomew knew she was talking directly to him. "Yes," he said. He was disappointed with not telling his mother the truth, that he had a very bad feeling about that night. "Good," she said, and she got out of the car. Dmitri and Bartholomew followed suit. The three of them walked low and slowly, careful not to disturb even the most distant domesticated pet of the neighborhood. Suddenly, Bartholomew's cell phone went off. It startled everyone. Diane had gotten that phone for him to contact her in case of emergencies, and as far as she knew, she was the only other person in the world who would call him on it. "Put that thing away," she snapped through a whisper. "Who would be calling you?" asked Dmitri, genuinely surprised. Bartholomew ignored his brother's question and his mother's orders as he hurried off away from them and into the woods to answer it. "Bartholomew," called Diane, but it was too late. He was out of earshot. "If you're not back by this van, when we're set to go, we're leaving without you," she said. Again, no response. "Screw him," said Dmitri. He and his mother proceeded into the house. Bart found himself in the thick surroundings of the forest before he dared answer the phone. He himself had no idea who would call him, especially at that particular ungodly time of night. Yet as soon as he pushed the button, he knew all at once what it was. Although he could not see them, he felt the millions and millions of tiny little gnomes exit the phone speaker and into his ear. "Don't go," they said in unison. "Stay out of that house." Bart's eyes glazed over from the shock of what he was hearing. What was to become of his mother and brother? "It's too late for them," said the gnomes. Once more, speaking with a singular voice. "Run away," they continued. "Run far, far away." When Bart came to, he was in a ditch about 3 miles down the road. He found himself lying on his back and staring up at the night sky. His jean jacket was a little damp now from the puddle and moist leaves that bedded him. He had no idea where exactly he was, only that it was the road his family had traveled upon to get to the house. He heard something. It was a vehicle approaching, and so he sat up, thinking it might be Diane and Dmitri coming for him. Who else would be on the road this late at night? However, as the car was approaching, Bartholomew quickly identified it to be that of a sheriff's patrol vehicle. It was heading from the direction of the house, and Bartholomew immediately began to sense trouble. He got down low by the side of the road and watched it pass. As it did so, Bart saw a silhouette of a woman sitting in the back seat. It looked a lot like his mother, and Bart's sixth sense told him that indeed it was. "29. When Diane and Dmitri approached the front door, Diane retrieved a small device to pick the lock with. "They've got no alarm on this place," she said quietly to her son. "Yeah," replied Dmitri. "I saw that." It wasn't long before the front door slowly slid open. They entered the dark living room, and Diane immediately got to work. Dmitri started a bit late behind his mother. He had a very uneasy feeling, almost as if someone or something was watching him. It wasn't until he tilted his head up and stared at the ceiling did he know the reason why. There, looking down at him through a hole in the ceiling, was a relatively large, gleaming eye. It was red, and it sent shivers down Dimitri's spine despite the fact that he knew he had to go and investigate it. He left his mother's side. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Upstairs," was his reply. "Be careful," said Diane. "They're sleeping." Dmitri nodded his head in agreement and began to inch his way up the staircase. Every creak the steps made with Dimitri's feet were like a sharp dagger to his sense of security. Yet eventually, he fought through his hesitation and made it to the top. The hallway to the bedroom was empty and long. Dmitri felt an impending sense of doom as he sought to discover what had been watching him and his mother. He approached the door with curiosity and fear. Dmitri stood above Dan and Theresa as they slept in their bed. His eyes glared. He resented them so. Suddenly he felt the grip around his ankle. It was tight, like the way his mother used to squeeze his arm when she would be angry with him in his boyhood. Only this was tighter. Dmitri tried to pull his leg away just before the yank came, and he fell backwards to the floor with a thud. "Shush," came a horrible voice from under the bed. Dmitri tried to breathe through his panic, but it was not working. He kicked and flailed about before his body was sucked under the bed with such force it didn't give him time to scream. Outside of the house, the night was still. In the distance, crickets tried to charm other crickets with their peeping routine. There was a gentle breeze that stoked the air into being just slightly more cool and refreshing. Dimitri's body flew through the second-floor window like a human projectile of chaos and wrath. The glass shattered and rained down like hellfire. Dmitri felt his body soar. Everything seemed to slow down for him in this trauma. He felt accentuated by every wave of his arm or his leg. He had managed to turn over in mid-flight, and now looked to the night sky and the second-floor window he had just shot out of, as his body dropped to the ground like a stone in the ocean. The first thing he heard was the crunch, and he was instantly aware that his time on Earth had been reduced to mere moments. Dimitri's body began to tingle all over. He was able to lift his right hand briefly before losing all of his senses but his sense of sight. That loud crunch he had heard had been the breaking of his fourth and fifth vertebrae as he landed on a water sprinkler. The trauma to Dimitri's body and the trauma to the irrigation system of that front lawn seemed to be in sync. Dimitri's fall, and the fact that he had landed on one of the sprinklers, was enough to disrupt the underground piping. Water began to spray from the ground, all over. It was almost as if it were raining upside down. Dan and Theresa were able to rush to the window, the light in their bedroom now on, to witness this. Dan looked down at Dmitri and saw the young man close his eyes and smile as he felt the cool, refreshing water rain down on him and everything else. It was there that he died. Diane came bursting out of the front door, and all she could do was scream in absolute agony. She rushed to her son's aid and held him. It took some strength on her part to unhook her son's mangled spine from the water sprinkler, but when she did so, she rocked his upper torso as if it were a baby in her arms. Yes, he was dead, but to her, whatever last spark of life that remained in him would be comforted by his mother. Dan and Theresa watched from their front doorstep as Diane was hauled away to the patrol car by Sheriff Jack Friedman. Diane screamed in a fitful rage of agony and despair. "My son," she cried, "my son!" Jack put her in the back of his patrol car, but not before shooting Dan one more look. Dan felt himself in the pit of his own stomach. He knew that Jack would return. Was he really going to have to explain how this young man had just shot out from under his bed and out the window screaming? He dreaded going back inside. But he did so, and he took Theresa with him as they watched the patrol car pull away. The sheriff and the psychic had been driving for a while before any of them said a word. Diane had quenched her tears now, and she only stared blankly out the window, empty. Jack would routinely take notice of her in his rearview mirror. "So what's your story?" she finally said. "My story?" asked Jack. "Yeah," she said. "There was no alarm set up at the house, and not a lot of neighbors in the area. So how did you know to go there?" "I just had a feeling," said Jack. "A feeling?" asked Diane. "Had you been there before?" "Yes," said Jack. "Yes, I have." "I see," she said. "So is it really haunted?" "I don't know," he said. Diane continued to stare out the window. "These woods look spooky," said Diane, absent-mindedly. Jack looked at her once more in the rearview mirror. "Are you really a psychic?" he finally asked. "No," admitted Diane with almost a laugh. "It's a con." "I figured as much." They drove on through that long stretch of rural roads. The tree line along the side of the curvy road was dark and foreboding, as tall tops leaned over and shaded the blacktop from moonlight. Jack was driving, was focused on driving, was eagerly driving, wanting to get this woman to the station so he could go back and ask Dan and Theresa some very thorough follow-up questions. But then it happened. It stepped out into the road and into Jack's headlights. It was there, all right. It was unmistakably there. The beast that Jack remembered. It stood taller than 7 feet. The lean, muscular body of a man with the head of an elk. It stared straight into the patrol car. Jack screamed in panic and yanked the wheel to his right. The car reacted as commanded. A violent shift in direction occurred, and Diane was tossed from one side to the other in the back seat. The car flew into the ditch and slammed into a nearby tree. Diane's body was thrown into the passenger seat next to Jack as his face was smashed against the dashboard. Blood erupted from her forehead and blinded her eyes. Jack felt himself lean forward, his legs and knees pinned underneath the broken steering wheel. He heard Diane moaning and slowly listened to her lose her sanity. She reached for Jack with bloody fingers. "Dmitri, is that you?" she asked. Jack figured she would be dead soon, and he felt an overwhelming wash of sympathy for her. "Yeah, Mom, it's me," he said, and with that he took her hand. "Daddy?" she asked, squeezing his hand tightly. Yep, said Jack. Her mind was all over the place now. One minute she thought he was her son, the next she thought he was her father. Jack noticed that smoke had begun to billow up from the floor panels and engine. The car was now on fire. There was a small explosion and the front hood of the patrol car, damaged as it was, blew off in a burst of flames. The fire was spreading quickly now, and crackling as if it were capable of feeling vitriolic anger. Jack squeezed the psychic's hand tightly. They were both doomed now. "I'm here, Mom," he said, trying his best to sound normal as the seat and air around him began to get hotter and hotter. "Oh, Dad," came the reply. "Thank God you made it. I was worried you wouldn't come." "Yeah, well," said Jack, "I'm here now." Suddenly, Jack's door flew open. It didn't just open. It was ripped open and flung across to the other side of the road. Jack now looked on in horror as the beast with the elk's head looked down at him. It manhandled its hands into the mangled car and bent the metal easily to free Jack from his demise. It threw Jack almost as easily as it threw the door. Jack rolled across the road in agonizing pain. Every nerve in his body was shot. The beast soon returned with Diane and laid her down next to Jack. She was moaning and talking under her breath incoherently. Her face had been badly burned and was now black and smoldering, but she was alive, and so was Jack. The monster looked down at Jack and into his eyes intently. It held both of its hands together to signify what Jack understood to be some sign of unity. "Together," said the beast with a rasping, rolling voice, and then looked over at Diane, meaning that the sheriff and the psychic should be together, and with that, the beast left quickly on foot back into the forest. In the bedroom, Dan and Theresa waited. It was Theresa who finally spoke. "You want the kid?" she asked, exhausting her frustrations and fear. "Yes," hissed the voice. "Well, it's me," she said calmly. "Theresa, no," Dan interjected. Theresa ignored him and continued to speak to the monster. "So how's this gonna work? Are you gonna come out and get me, or do I have to crawl under there?" "No," said Dan. "I'm the kid," Dan was adamant. Despite this, Theresa still ignored him. "Dan, stop," she finally said. "No, you stop. This has gone on long enough, damn it. Theresa, I'm the kid. I've resented you for petty reasons. I've stepped out. I've been distant. I've been running away. All I want to know is, how did you find out about the gravesite and the etching?" "It was with you for a long time," said the voice. "I've been with you a long time." "God damn it," said Dan. "I'm the kid. Take me." "I've been with you longer than you know," continued the voice. "I've been with the both of you longer than you know." "What's that supposed to mean?" asked Dan. "It means I can never die," replied the voice. "Bullshit," said Dan. He got down on the floor and peeked under the bed, just in time to see the monster scurry away into the dark shadows and vanish. Dan looked up at Theresa with wide-eyed amazement. "He's scared of us," said Dan. "It's like he senses something. An end to all of this." "I sense it too," said Theresa. Dan crawled onto the bed. He gestured and invited Theresa to join him. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Come here," he said. The two of them embraced and kissed passionately on the bed. "What are we doing?" Theresa asked. "That thing is still down there." "No, it's not," said Dan. "It's gone." Dan rolled over on top of her, and she felt the fever heat of his arousal. They kissed once more as Dan's hands roamed her body. "Don't do it," said the voice from under the bed. Dan winced and punched the mattress. "God damn it," he said. The voice laughed. "You don't know the half of it," it said. 32. Bartholomew loved machines, but more than anything, he loved his 1986 Harley-Davidson XLH 883. He would often take it apart and put it back together again. He rode on that bike and let it roar, and he felt alive and free. He had just left the hospital where his mother was staying. She was joined by the sheriff who attempted to arrest her, and they now seemed to be falling in love despite her disfigured face. The day was bright, and the sunlight was shining. It was a beautiful day. Bartholomew pulled into the driveway of Dan and Theresa's house. He was on a mission. He put the kickstand down and slid off the bike like he'd dismount from a small horse. He walked slowly up the lawn, taking careful note where his brother had died the previous night. He knocked on the door. It was soon after a moment in which the door was answered. Dan was there, looking Bart straight in the eyes. "Do I need my gun for this?" asked Dan, deadpan. "No," replied Bartholomew simply, and with that Bart retrieved some papers from the inner coat pocket of his jean jacket. He held them up by his side for Dan to see. "What's that?" asked Dan. "You don't know?" replied Bart. "No, I don't." "Drop the charges against my mother, and I'll tell you how you can kill it," was all Bart said to him. Dan thought about this moment. "Did you get that from the attic?" "I got it from my brother." Bartholomew looked to the spot, now cleared of his brother's remains. "My father's safe?" asked Dan. "Yes, something like that, I would imagine." Bart now looked to Dan. "If you promise to drop the charges against my mother, I will tell you how to kill it." Upon hearing this, Dan held out his hand to receive the papers. "I promise," he said, "if you promise never to come back here again." "I can do that," said Bart, and he handed Dan the papers. Dan perused them casually, trying to make sense of what was written inside of the few short seconds his attention could spare from this conversation. "Well?" Dan muttered. "It bleeds memories," said Bart. "It bleeds memories, and it must be killed separately. By each of you," Bart continued. Dan looked up from the papers he held to see that Bart was already leaving. He thought about what Bart had told him and wondered about the struggle ahead. He figured the first thing he ought to do was read what was given to him. Not by this fellow or by his brother, but by his father. Bart rode long and hard on that day. His destination was far, far away to the west coast, and his chopper would carry him. He suddenly felt an odd sensation with every rev of his engine. The gnomes were leaving him. They burst their way out of the Harley's exhaust like a steam of little black floating ants. This was no longer just a motorcycle. This was an exorcist bike. The harder Bart drove it, the faster the gnomes were exhumed. He loved the sensation of the little tiny monsters leaving him forever. He knew they were leaving him forever. He just knew it. The bike was getting rid of them once and for all. "33. Dan held the kitchen knife in his hand, and Theresa stood by his side. "You might not want to stick around for this," he said to her. They found themselves in the bedroom once more. "Why?" she asked. "Is it because you're afraid of what I'll see?" "Yes," said Dan, "mostly." Suddenly the bed began to rise. It was slowly lifting from one side, and all at once Dan and Theresa saw the full size of their recent tormentor. It stood tall, taller than any man Dan had seen, but it was not a man at all. It looked like a giant lizard. The sound of its breathing was like a cat with a fur ball caught in its mouth. "So," said the monster, "you finally come for me." "Yes," said Dan, "that's right." "Are you ready?" asked the monster, and with that it tossed the entire bed aside. The bed flew across the room with a loud, chaotic bang. It frightened Dan that the monster exhibited such strength. Yet, frightened or not, Dan charged the monster fiercely. Effortlessly, it backhanded Dan with its giant claw hand, and Dan went flying into the wall, dazed and bruised. It was now the monster's turn to approach Dan, and it did so slowly. Quickly dashing to his feet, Dan stabbed the beast in the heart, and it let out a roar. Suddenly, his friend Jeremy appeared in the corner of the room. "Hey, Dan," said Jeremy. "Remember that time in high school when you fucked that hooker and never paid her? That was hilarious." Suddenly, Jeremy lifted his head up and stared at the ceiling until he turned black all over and dropped to the floor as a pile of ash. Dan retracted his blade from the monster's heart and stabbed it again. This time it was the monster's throat. And now, in another part of the room, Dan's mother appeared. "I know," she said. "I know you were out having sex when my last moments were spent in my deathbed." And with that, she too turned to ash. Dan was trying not to focus on these horrible thoughts he was having as a result of the ghostly appearances, but it was getting harder. In a fitful rage, he stabbed the monster in the eye. The monster let out a deafening roar. This time the semblance of Theresa appeared in the room. The real Theresa looked on in shock as she saw a mirror image of herself standing not but 3 feet away from her. The semblance of Theresa spoke to Dan. "Remember when you said you loved me?" And with that the semblance screamed as it turned black and dropped to a pile of ash. Dan was done now. The monster laid on the floor, struggling to breathe. Theresa was shocked to see what had just happened. The monster slowly vanished before their very eyes. "It's not over," Dan quickly said to Theresa, but it was too late. The monster had suddenly reappeared right behind Theresa and now had a firm grip over her body. She screamed. Dan tossed Theresa the knife, and she caught it. She quickly went to stab the monster that held her from behind, but the monster stopped her by grabbing her hand. "Something tells me it's not going to be as easy for you," growled the monster. Theresa struggled to move, but she just couldn't. Dan, in a panic, looked for a way to help her. He picked up a splintered piece of wood from the bed frame. It was the leg of the bed. He tossed it to her. Theresa dropped the knife with one hand and caught the makeshift club with the other. With a burst of energy and adrenaline, she was able to quickly break free, turn around, and smash the monster in the face with her wooden club. The blow was hard enough so that the semblance of Peter appeared in the corner of the room. "Cindy Thompson had bigger tits than you," said the semblance of Petey, and with that he, like the others, turned black and turned into a pile of ash. Without thinking twice, Theresa then swung her mallet like a golf club and clubbed the monster's groin area. In another part of the room, an adolescent boy appeared. He was the kid from the flower shop. He held a bouquet in his hand. "I bought these for you," said the ghostly image of the boy, and then all at once he turned to black and dropped to ash. Dan rushed at the monster, and in a split second the monster took notice of him and roared. It was that particular roar that sent Dan flying backwards into the mattress, which now leaned against the wall. The mattress toppled over onto Dan, followed by the large grandfather clock which stood in the corner of the room, pinning Dan to the floor. But Dan was not needed as much as he might have thought, for Theresa was going crazy now. She was beating the monster repeatedly, while images of her past sexual transgressions appeared in the room and then turned to blackened ash. Dan might have thought her to be a tremendous slut, given all that she had to destroy, if he wasn't so madly in love with her in that moment. The monster was lying on the floor now. Every breath it drew resulted in a small amount of black blood to erupt from between its thin lizard lips. It was dying, if not dead. Theresa was herself exhausted and breathless. She panted, hunched over, as she gazed upon her violent handiwork. Dan was able to spy all of this from under the mattress when he suddenly felt the floor beneath him begin to shift. "Theresa," he managed to say as he now knew the floor to be tilting downward and opening up to a vast darkness. Dan was under the mattress, and thus under the bed, and he began to fear that he might be headed to wherever it was the monster came from. He slid effortlessly down the hardwood floor. It was too late for Theresa to answer the man she loved. He had already gone, completely disappeared. Dan found himself dropped onto a hard stone floor. There was a spotlight on him. Where the source of that light came from, he was unaware of. He heard echoing footsteps all around him. They seemed to be in a hurry. With all of this frantic scurrying about, a black-hooded man suddenly approached him. "We don't have much time," said the man. "Whatever you do, stay right where you are and don't look around." The man dropped his hood behind his head, revealing himself to be Sir Peter Francis. "Who are you?" asked Dan. "You might say I'm an old friend of your father's," replied Francis as he knelt down in front of Dan. Dan slowly sat up, sore from his fall. "What?" Dan asked, barely able to comprehend his own pulse. He rubbed his aching head and tried not to squint in pain at the elderly man who now spoke to him. "Many years ago, your father saved me, and so in return, I've promised to help you." "You're going to have to start from the beginning," said Dan. Francis smiled a little, almost laughed. "I'm afraid I can't do that. It would take much too long, and we do not have the time. It took all my power just to bring you here briefly." "Are you responsible for that thing that has been tormenting my girlfriend and I?" asked Dan, ready to come to blows with the old man. "No," said Francis. "All I can say is that a rift has occurred between our two worlds. That is the spiritual plane on which I exist, and the world of reality in which you exist. It's a very old rift, and it has affected both our worlds for a very long time." Dan looked around him and saw that the darkness he was in was merely a black painted circus tent. He looked up and saw that the source of his spotlight was actually just a hole in the top of the tent where sunlight was shining through. "Where am I?" asked Dan. "Trust me, I'm trying to keep you safe here. There are sights outside of this tent so beautiful and—" Francis paused. "So beautiful that it would destroy your mind and you would never be able to love again." "What is it that you want from me?" "You need to make love to Theresa. That's it. It will be your orgasm that seals the gate between these two worlds." Dan got disgusted by the old man's bluntness and use of the word orgasm. "What the fuck are you talking about?" "Daniel," said Francis, "you're in Eden right now." The man spoke with such intensity and such clarity that it shook every bone in Dan's body. "I want to get out," shouted Daniel, and he attempted to sit up, but the old man stopped him. "You must not leave the confines of our shade," said Francis. "It isn't much, I know. It's makeshift, but it's the best we could do under such extreme circumstances." "Bullshit," snapped Dan, and this time he was able to get up, not just to sit up, but to stand. Francis cautiously kept his hands on his guest and left his eyes open for Dan to see the old man's concern. Dan swatted Sir Peter's touch away. "I have to find Theresa." "She isn't here," pleaded Sir Francis, but it was almost too late. Dan's steps towards the edge of his confines had already begun. There was another hooded monk who rushed to intervene against Dan's attempt at escaping. He dashed through the air with his arms outstretched and tackled Dan to the hard stone floor. "Don't make him bleed," cried Sir Francis. Dan lifted his face from the floor and gasped for air to escape from beneath his blunt pain. "You don't understand," said Dan. "Theresa's in trouble." Francis was quickly approaching his accomplice, and Dan now. "I understand perfectly," said Francis. "It is you who is in the dark." "Then let me into the light," cried Dan, and with that he broke free from his captor, got to his feet once more, and rushed through the black curtain wall that stood before him, parting it so easily. "No!" he heard Sir Peter Francis shout behind him, but the shout faded as he now stood in a new atmosphere, with sounds resonating differently. "35. Francis was right. It was beautiful, and it was too much. Daniel was in awe until he succumbed to the wild prosperity of belief. He felt himself instantly aroused in every sense of the word. His eyes felt wide like the yearning mouth of a young lioness's cub, or some other small thing destined for greatness. There were pastures and valleys and mountains and rivers and rainforests and sandy beaches, all of them before him. Everything was before him, and everything was endowed with such greatness. The colors were 1,000 times brighter and 1,000 times more exotic than Earth. This new world was vibrating in an electric spectrum, and it was at peace with its peacock feathers, despite the fact that Daniel Livingston now found himself under the glorious touch of a sojourner's ecstasy, which lifted him almost as much as it remained inside of him. Everything sounded like he was on an airplane and needed to decompress his muted eardrums. His senses became defined only by their own limitations. He saw a waterfall that flowed upwards into the sky, where it spilled out over the clouds, as if the clouds were the rocky bottom, and faded into the soothing blue. It had a postcard beauty, but it was always and entirely unknown. Dan began to pick out the sights individually. High above, he saw a pterodactyl attack and eat a large crane bird in mid-flight. As brutal as this picked piece might have been, it was that cold comfort that hinted to Dan of a natural existence beyond his own experiences, however short or long they may have been in this strange new land. Off in the distance he saw a mountain lion walking upright, wearing a loincloth and carrying a spear. It was a hunter. It was a native to this land, and there was pride in every stride to that fact. It seemed perfectly unconcerned by Dan's stunned and amazed gaze as it went about its business, weaving in and out of the different forests casually. And yet, beyond the landscape of beauty, Dan saw dark clouds, as black could be. They dropped bolts of purple lightning over a rocky and desolate wasteland and clapped thunder like the punctuation to a shaman's spell. There were the tiny silhouettes of distant creatures, dutifully marching off a mountain top to their doom. They looked like ants to Dan, and their actions puzzled him. There was just such a disconnect between what he saw over in the east and what he saw under those dark clouds in the south. It was like two worlds existing under the same sky, nearly oblivious to one another. Francis exited the tent behind Dan and was shouting with his hands waving in the air. Dan was a good distance ahead of Francis, and it became difficult to make out what the old man was saying. "You're in danger," he thought he heard Francis say. And so with that, Dan ran. He ran through the golden field where he presently stood, and into the nearest forest. The forest was gated by a tall tree which sprouted from its branches a vast assortment of exotic and plain fruit. There was papaya and kiwi, apples and bananas, pears and oranges, and a list of others that Dan could not think to name, all on the same tree. Small furry creatures hung from the branches and gorged themselves, the juices from every bite spilling from their furry lips. They had large black eyes that shined like marbles and thousands of tiny sharp teeth. They could smile wide from ear to ear and had pot-bellies stuffed with breakfast, lunch, and dinner, all fruit. They seemed perfectly content in ignoring Dan and his entrance into the majestic jungle that lay before him. Dan ran, not stopping to see any of the bizarre creatures that may or may not have been stalking him. "This isn't a fucking safari," he said to himself out loud. His brash statement almost sounded convincing until suddenly he lost his footing and he found himself rolling violently down a steep ravine. He landed, stone to face, in a thin babbling brook that was just deep enough to infiltrate his nostrils and cause him to quickly raise his head and cough. The water was cool and fresh as it ran right down from the purest mountain. But it was there, as Dan began to recover his senses, that the overwhelming safari took hold of him. He tried his best to connect the dots, to make some sense of the fact that not 5 minutes ago he was in his bedroom, battling some ungodly creature, and now he felt 1,000,000 miles away and completely lost. Dan quickly learned that he had twisted his knee on the fall down and would no longer be able to keep such an agile pace. He rolled off of his stomach and sat on the banks of the babbling brook with his knee outstretched. He heard a splashing come from down the brook and, after a moment's hesitation, realized that whatever it was that came down the way, he did not have the time or strength to hide from it. Resigning to this newfound passive reasoning, he looked up to see a handsome elderly man riding an ostrich. It was certainly not what he was expecting. Within moments, the man had slowed his stride to stand before Dan proudly. The old man wore a red smoking jacket and ascot. Dan recalled that this stranger looked remarkably like Hugh Hefner. The old man just looked down at Dan for a moment before smiling. "You're in the flower shop now, my boy," he quipped. Dan furrowed his brow in defensive posturing. He felt intruded upon. Could this bizarre character that looked down at him have some secret access to Dan and his thoughts of Theresa, which now came flooding through him? Dan thought if he looked around and examined some of the exotic flowers that he might indeed find some which would be present at the flower shop where Theresa worked. He returned his gaze to the old man. "Don't worry, kid," said the man. "You'll forget it all the moment you pop." And with that, the old man flicked his thumb up from his fist and smiled warmly once more. It was either a symbol for A-OK or, which would be more likely in this case, a euphemism for the sexual act. "How do I get back to her?" pleaded Dan. He suddenly realized that fleeing from Sir Peter Francis was a big mistake. "You'll find her," said the old man. "She's around here somewhere." "She's not here," shouted a voice from the trees on top of the steep incline from which Daniel fell. It was Sir Peter Francis. "Daniel, where are you?" Francis emerged at the top of the incline. He saw the old man on top of the ostrich. "Who are you?" he shouted. "Who, me?" replied the old man. "I'm one of the good guys." "Well, can't you see the boy's here all alone?" cried Francis. The old man looked down at Daniel once more. "You mean?" he asked. "Yes," shouted Francis. Dan looked around for someone other than himself to witness this confusing little exchange, but there was none, just him and the two strangers. One of them he knew a little bit better than the other, but not by much. The bazaar was normal here, and very little garnered attention from this strange land's inhabitants. The Hugh Hefner look-alike quickly rode off on his ostrich without giving Daniel another acknowledgement, and Sir Francis found a couple of sure steps down that incline to help Daniel up. "You should not have run off like that," scolded Francis. "I don't know what more I can do for you." "Did that monster come from here?" It was now Daniel's turn to be aggressive. He had a tight grip on the old man's cloak now. "Yes," said Francis, and he swatted away Daniel's grip. "Now unhand me." "Who are you?" Daniel asked. "I am neutral." "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" "It means that in a land of pairs, I am one. There are others like me." "What is going on in this place? Why did that monster attack Theresa and me?" "It did not attack you," said Francis. "It frightened you." Francis now braced Daniel with his body so the young man could stand and walk. "Come with me," he said. "Where are we going?" asked Dan. "Some place very dangerous." Every breath for it was painful, and she could see how lean the monster was by simply noting how much it could expand its chest for the inhale of breath. Suddenly Dan appeared, sitting Indian style behind the beast. She knew this to be yet another hallucination, but wished so greatly that it was him, that he really was there. The semblance of Dan put a gentle hand on the dying monster's ribcage and looked up at Theresa. "Theresa," he said, "remember how we first met?" There was calmness in the semblance of Dan's voice, so much, in fact, that she could hardly recognize it. Theresa picked up the kitchen knife that still lay on the floor and slowly approached the giant green lizard in the middle of her bedroom floor. She looked at Dan once more and pointed to the monster with her knife. "You're not real," she said. Dan and the monster spoke as one. "Yeah, I am." It was a deep, throaty growl that emanated from the both of them. "What's going on?" she asked. "Theresa, I'm not where you think I am." "I know you're not. You're just a hallucination." She walked over to the mattress. "Theresa, wait," said the semblance of Dan. She turned and faced him, halting her progress towards the mattress. "How is it that you and the monster spoke as one?" "You have to understand," said Dan. "I'm talking to you from a very strange place right now. A place where you go. A place where we all go, but our spirits won't let us remember." The semblance looked around and then down at the dying monster. "I'm using channels of communication that I, myself, fully don't understand. The monster and I speaking together was a malfunction. Dan, you sound very different right now." "I feel very different right now," said the semblance of Dan. He lifted his outstretched hand and implored her to take it. "Come here," he said. "I can't touch you." "Yes, you can." Theresa cautiously approached the semblance of Dan. "Do you remember how we first met?" he asked calmly. "Yes, of course," said Theresa. "Tell it to me." "What?" "Tell me the story," said the semblance of Dan. Theresa suddenly felt that something was wrong in the pit of her stomach. Theresa held the knife close to her now. "Theresa, what are you going to do with that knife?" asked the semblance of Dan. "I know you are not Dan," said Theresa. "Put the knife down," said the semblance of Dan. "We have much to talk about." The monster on the floor lifted its head up slowly, as if it had been listening this whole time, and just now started to take notice of what was being said. Its eyes blinked and fluttered. It craved nourishment. Theresa took a step back. "Who are you?" she asked the semblance of Dan. "I'm a friend," smiled the apparition before her. "You're not like the others," she said. "Well, Daniel isn't exactly just a past to you, is he?" "No," said Theresa. "Can I see the knife?" asked the semblance of Dan. It nodded to the monster that lay next to it. "I should be the one to put this little pet of ours to sleep." "Pet? What is this, a fucking joke?" "Daniel, that's no pet," said Theresa. The semblance of Daniel just smiled. "You're not Daniel, are you?" she asked behind an invisible blanket of fear. Again, this so-called Daniel was smiling as he slowly shook his head. No. "37. Sir Peter Francis and Daniel were journeying through the thicket of jungle vines with wide leaves the size of full-grown watermelons. Daniel had recovered his balance and step from the fall he had taken earlier. But what had not subsided, which now still throbbed in every lobe of his brain, was his bewilderment. He was unsure with his internal scale what puzzled him more, his surroundings and circumstances, or his unfounded trust from this monk traveling beside him. Daniel needed to test this scale, and he needed to test right that moment, before they went any further. "Wait," he said. Daniel stood his ground, unwilling to take another step until Francis acknowledged him. Francis turned and looked to his young accomplice. "What is it?" he asked. I'm not going any further until you tell me where we're going. Daniel seemed to be panting now. The hike and the questions in his mind made him feel exhausted. He looked around him for a moment. The air around here feels different, he said, commenting on the fact that although his lungs were working and felt sustained, he felt like he was in a vacuum with no air apparent. That's because there isn't any, and if you stay here too long, you'll be dead, said Francis. What are you talking about? Most people are here for no longer than half a second. Francis started up the path again. Of course, time is all relative, he said under his breath. He looked back to Dan, expecting him to follow. We're going to the caverns. Caverns? Asked Dan. He was following. He figured if he got answers along the way, it would save time. Caverns, yes, said Francis. That's correct. Why? Because there is a certain kind of fire. Francis spoke now as if he was reciting to his newfound pupil. Its flames are transparent, and it cannot be seen under the sun, only in darkness. These flames will illuminate the truth. You will look inside them and understand why you are here. Francis looked at Daniel intently now. You will understand everything. The caverns, started Daniel. Is that where I saw those dark clouds? Yes, said Francis, and they traveled on. That's the only place to find darkness here. Why? Asked Daniel. Why is it dark? Upon hearing this, Francis just stopped dead in his tracks. He turned and looked at his young company. I mean, this is Eden, right? I mean, like you said before, Eden. Things so beautiful. Francis had started walking again, but Daniel knew he was letting him talk as he followed behind. Things so beautiful that if I remember any of this, I'll never be able to love again in the real world. Yes, something like that. So why? Why would there be those clouds in a place like this? I saw animals and creatures marching to their death. They were walking right off the fucking cliff. They no longer want to live anymore. Well, I got that. There's a war going on here, Daniel. I suppose I should have told you this. Maybe that would have deterred you from running away from me in the first place. Why did you take me here? It was a mistake I was destined to do, said Francis. I thought if I could just keep you in that tent. What do you mean, destined? Asked Daniel. I don't know, fated perhaps. Sometimes there is a chain of occurrences, said Francis, and you can avoid the outcome for a very long time, but not forever. What's that supposed to mean? There have been many wars here in the past, Daniel, and many more, I'm sure, are to follow in the future. Yeah? Your father, started Francis. Your father and your mother. What about them? Francis scoffed. I've said too much. Too much? Daniel was raising his voice now. Too much? You think you've said too much? It's something that you will come to understand when you gaze into the flames of the translucent fire, said Francis. Daniel was angered by the fact that he did not know enough to argue with the old man. Well, tell me this, he said. Is any of this real? Is it all just a dream? None of it is real to you, said Francis, and then, sensing a coming sigh of relief from Daniel, he cautioned with his tone of voice. That doesn't mean that there is no danger. Well, if none of it is real, to you, corrected Francis. None of it is real to you. Daniel could hardly utter his response as they came to the very edge of that long and thick and winding jungle. They stood at the edge of a tall cliff that overlooked a deep valley of red rock mountains and bleak desert sand, the color of crimson tears. There were raging rivers of a black concentrated substance which seemed to boil and pop with intense heat. To me, said Daniel in horror. I know nothing of heaven and hell, my young friend, stated Francis, But if hell does exist, then one must see our wastelands as a very gracious tribute. And with that he started down a new path. It ran along the edge of the cliffside. Daniel followed. For the first time he was distracted from all of his surroundings. The urge for a cigarette had poked its ugly head from behind the general awe he felt. He might as well have been 1,000,000 miles from the nearest 7-Eleven, from which he could purchase a pack of Camel Lights. This great distance made the urge all the more richer. "Fuck," he said out loud. "What is it?" asked Francis, as the two of them traveled along. "I need a cigarette," replied Dan. "Oh," mused Francis, "I never understood the pollutants human beings would acquire to satisfy their manifested desires. Is it perhaps some kind of death wish?" "No," said Daniel, "nothing so grandiose. It's chemicals, brain matter. You wouldn't understand." "Because I haven't a brain?" "Precisely," said Daniel. "I see," said Francis. "Fuck," was Daniel's response. The need was in his bloodstream now, and he could even feel it in his arms. All it would take to ease this discomfort would be a single drag, but a smoke was nowhere to be found. What they did find, however, was a large hole in the ground. "What's this? Bear trap?" asked Daniel. "No," said Francis. "This is what we are looking for." He looked at Daniel with a foreign smile. "We're not bears, are we?" "I'm not," said Daniel, with a little bit of an attitude. He was tired of being a foreigner, and he was tired of the obvious and not so obvious questions he constantly found himself facing in this strange new land. "What's in that hole?" he asked. Francis sensed that Daniel was tired of playing games. It might have been that brain chemistry he alluded to earlier, and its need for nicotine, or it might have been the overwhelming circumstances of the situation. Regardless, Francis decided to give his young accomplice a straight answer. "It's an entrance," he said. "It will take us to the dark caverns." "Yeah?" "Yeah," replied Francis. "So you can light this little fire of yours?" Francis opted not to acknowledge the condescending phrase of the question. He knew that they were getting closer to danger, and now was not the time to quibble over sarcastic responses. "Yes," he said. He was serious, and Daniel sensed this. 38. Theresa's life lingered in long fashion before she and Dan became together as one. One single unit, however dysfunctional, and although this lingering life of hers still hung like ripe fruit, waiting for the hands of fate to pluck it, she felt different now. She felt her status to be whole. On the day the two of them met, the weatherman predicted rain. Strong storm clouds with sheets of downpour and lightning to strike like bullets. But there was none of that. By midday, some divine overseer in the sky, reserving an idle hand, had pushed the storm system out to sea with its almighty and giant index finger. It was cigarettes that brought them together. Theresa was trying to quit. Where did they meet? Were the rays of sunshine any different that day? Maybe just a little bit brighter. It was on a beach, a weekday, virtually empty. Though the circumstances that drew both of them to the shore that day were of different shades, their chance encounter was the color of innocence. It was the color between them. A whole new spectrum, like you could never imagine. Theresa needed a light. She walked the beach alone and hoped that she would not see a single guy. She did not want to be hit on. She wanted to be left alone, and it was brave of her to walk alone. Brave in the sense that she risked an awkward encounter with some strange boy she had never met. Try and get her phone number. These thoughts made her a little self-conscious because although in the mirror she looked quite attractive, she did not want to think of herself as an attractive person. She was smart enough to know that that was a trap. It was a painful road which she veered away from with great emotional and mental strength, but she needed a light. She had left her Zippo in the car. Daniel sat on a large piece of driftwood. It was Maine, in the fall. He had just inherited the house in Buxton, about 2 towns over. His father had been sent to the hospital, and it was the first time in a very long time that he had set out to clear his head. Perhaps the first time in his life. He saw her in the distance, and then he saw her slowly, gradually start to approach him. He didn't think anything of it at first, but then, as her body got closer, he felt his stomach start to turn. He really didn't feel like talking to anybody at that moment, but he was going to. Have to. Maybe it would be just some idle chatter about the weather and how the weatherman was wrong. Daniel prepared himself for that. "I need some fire," said Theresa confidently. She figured her confidence would allow her to slip away from any further dialogue. Confidence in conversation made things go by faster. Daniel handed her his lighter, and without thinking, she sat down next to him on that large log of driftwood. She didn't mean to do it. It just happened. Shit, she thought. And shit, she said out loud. Daniel just looked at her. She had to think of something quick to say to cover her irrational behavior. The ocean was all she could muster. "It's blue," said Dan without thinking. He didn't care at that moment how stupid he sounded. In fact, he had hoped his obtuse remark would scare her away. Surprisingly, it induced a further response. Theresa felt comforted by Daniel's odd remark. It opened some kind of door inside of her. It made her think that Daniel was just an odd stranger, and that she could tell him anything and it wouldn't matter. "It doesn't mean anything to me," was something she had never said to anybody before in her entire life regarding the ocean. It was almost a bit angry. She fancied herself a down-to-earth kind of girl. Dan felt attracted to her in a curious sort of way. This was something he did not expect. "It's nothing," he said. "It's just blue and nothing." There now. If that comment didn't allow her to leave, he didn't know what would. "What brings us here?" she asked. "I don't know," he said, speaking for her. "The edge," she said. "The edge of what?" Daniel asked. "I don't know." Now it was her turn for that response. "Can I have my lighter back?" asked Dan. Theresa gave it to him. "I should quit," she said. "Yeah, they're bad for you." "Yeah," sighed Theresa. "Seems like everything's bad for us these days, you know." "Even the edge," agreed Dan, and he nodded to that beautiful landscape before them. There were a few gulls in the air, but they made their presence known. They called to one another in a casual but foreign tongue. "You're the kind of guy that says shit just because he can," said Theresa. "Yeah," said Dan. "Who the fuck are you?" asked Theresa. She didn't quite mean to phrase the question in that way exactly, and just kind of came out. She wasn't usually that aggressive, but something inside of her just reached out. It was like she had claws in her stomach that just came out on a whim she herself could not fully appreciate. "I can't remember," said Dan. He was being facetious. For some ungodly reason, Theresa felt that she understood him. Without thinking, she switched gears. "But the ocean's not that bad, I guess," she said, looking off in the direction where Dan's eyes were fixed, that unknown focal point. "I'm just more of a lakes and rivers kind of girl, you know what I mean?" "Yeah." Theresa got up from her seat. "Well, thanks for the smoke," she said. She snubbed out the cigarette in the beach sand, hoping to be alone again. It was nice to share the same space with this stranger. She knew that she could go to bed that night feeling that all was not lost. At least she had one interaction with someone which was not business-related in any shape or form. "I didn't give you smoke, I gave you fire," said Daniel, and he was serious. "Yeah, well," mused Theresa, "where there's smoke." She started her steps away from the driftwood bench. She half expected Dan to finish that old cliché, but he didn't, and she respected him for that. She had to get away, get back to her walk. Despite what she had asked Dan, she knew what drew her to those sandy shores on that particular and perfect day. It was not happiness, and it was not sadness. It was a calm resolution that she had acquired from a forgotten dream she had the night before. It affected her whole day. And plus, the fight with her roommate, the tedious hours at the coffee shop. She knew she either had to do something drastic, like quit her job or move out of her apartment, but rather than do any of these things, she went for a walk on the beach. It was as if someone had begun to shake the tree from which her idle life had hung like ripe fruit. Someone or something. Further on up the beach, she saw an elderly couple walking and holding hands. The woman had a bouquet of flowers. As Theresa approached the elderly couple, she could see the old woman smiling at her. Still grinning, the old woman offered her the flowers she held. The gentleman beside her was a bit surprised, but did not reject his wife's notions. "Do you want these?" asked the old woman. Without thinking, Theresa took the flowers from the old woman. The elderly couple, they looked like immigrants, and the woman spoke with a gypsy accent. It suddenly occurred to Theresa that she had accepted the flowers before she could politely refuse them out of any kind of self-conscious formality. It was as if her hands acted on their own in reaching out for the gift. The elderly woman, her benefactor, did not see the awkwardness behind Theresa's barrage of warm, continuous smiles and nods. Words other than "thank you" just got stuck behind her tongue and her wide, smiling eyes that somehow... Words other than "thank you" just got stuck behind her tongue and her wide, smiling eyes that someone her own age might have interpreted as a ridicule were not seen by the older woman. She saw none of this. She saw no hesitation. She saw no awkwardness. Perhaps it was the infantile cataracts that were beginning to form around the old woman's pupils, or, which was an equally possible scenario, she saw only a young woman walking the beach alone. "A gift," said the old woman, as she watched the young woman make her way down the long stretch of beach, "from the last two lovers on earth." Theresa reached the rocky jetty at the far end of the beach. The flowers in her hand shifted abruptly in sync to her flowing brown hair, which flowed and danced in a fleeing salty breeze from the cold ocean. Her weighted steps against the soft sand slowed as she momentarily contemplated going further, climbing the rocks, and heading out away from shore. It was getting late in the afternoon, and so Theresa ultimately decided that to turn back would be her best recourse of action. But she wouldn't turn around just yet. No, instead she just smiled for no apparent reason. Her lungs expanded and became full of fresh air as she breathed in a deliberate breath. It was at that moment that she decided to quit smoking. At first thought, Daniel saw Theresa returning to his distant sight as some kind of mirage. Then logic set in a sort of what comes up must come down sort of way. The beach was not circular, so naturally she would eventually return. What he did not anticipate, however, was that as she got closer, she started to veer closer towards him. It wasn't long before she entered the parameter of conversation, about 7 feet. "Hi," she said. "Where'd you get the flowers?" asked Dan. "I picked them," she lied. It was for no other reason than the fact that she thought it was a cute answer. Flirtation to Theresa meant that she would lie with the understanding that she was lying, trying to be a little bit more mysterious than she actually was. She sat down next to Dan on the driftwood log. "You haven't moved," she mused. "I rarely do," replied Dan, with an air of indifference. Flirtation to Dan was a little less self-conscious. It simply meant that he would occasionally release his stoic self. "What does move you?" asked Theresa with a little emphasis. "Fate," replied Dan. "And when fate doesn't come, then nothing. Sounds like a pretty boring life." "It can be. Don't you think that fate has better things to do than to introduce you to beautiful girls?" smiled Theresa. "I find that beautiful girls have a way of introducing themselves." "Oh? Does that mean that you're some kind of player?" "No," said Dan. "I'm just talking. I don't really know what I'm saying." Dan looked around a moment. "I'm sorry. This has been a really weird day today. I had to put my father in a home." "He's that old?" "Yup." "Why?" "Early onset of Alzheimer's." Dan took a breath. "I'm trying to come to terms with the fact that he will someday forget about me." Theresa found herself saddened by this stranger. Her feelings, which only a moment ago were of playfulness and boredom, now became genuine but sad. She took on the challenge of finding something to say with the part of herself that carried her serious intellect and sympathy. "Well," she started, "maybe it isn't so much that they forget us, but start to see us in a different way." Dan contemplated this, but it didn't help him. Maybe there might be a different kind of honesty to that. "What do you mean?" asked Dan. "Well, suppose he starts calling you by the name of, like, his brother or something. Then that might start getting you to think of all the characteristics you and your uncle have in common. It might be a good thing, almost spiritual." "I don't have any uncles," said Dan. "In fact, I don't have very much family to speak of at all." "Your mother?" "She passed away," said Dan, trying not to think about it too much. Theresa knew that she should change the subject. "You know," she said, "I had this really strange dream about my parents last night." Dan looked at her. He was thankful that she was changing the subject. "They were in this really wild and crazy jungle, and they were both animals. My mother was a bird and my dad was a lion. Or was it the other way around?" Theresa started to trail off. She knew that she had started talking about something that was still very foggy in her mind. "What were they doing?" asked Dan. "They were fighting." "Why?" "I can't remember," said Theresa. "I just can't remember." Dan and Theresa eventually exchanged phone numbers, and their love began to grow very slowly. Dan became less of a studied subject to Theresa and more of a man, a boyfriend. The gift of flowers that Theresa got on that day withered and died, but they always remained with her. 39. The catacombs that Daniel and Francis traveled were dark and made from a red stone. Every step was a gamble on the uneven curvatures and jagged formations. What little light there was came from a torch held by Francis. "This way," he said, "and be quiet." "Why?" asked Daniel. Francis considered not answering this question. He compromised with his better judgment and instead spoke lightly. "This place is inhabited by a very dangerous creature. If it weren't for the fact that we need absolute darkness, I would advise you to stay completely clear." They came to an open space with a relatively smooth floor. It was an intersection of sorts, with caverns leading in all directions. Francis stopped Dan and knelt quietly to the ground. He retrieved from his person a small velvet bag from inside of his cloak. From the bag, he claimed an intricately carved fire plow. There was a long stick with a dull point and ancient writing along the side of it. There was also a flat piece of wood, also writing along the side of that, with a small groove cut into the end of it. Francis removed a small handful of a dry, straw-like substance. He snuffed the torch out into the ground until he and Daniel were in absolute darkness. Daniel was quiet like death as he listened to Francis fumble in the gloom and proceed with the fire flow. "I hate the darkness," said Daniel. "Not all darkness, but definitely this one." "Yeah, well, you should," he heard Francis mutter under his breath. Then there was a small white fire with a strong enough glow to illuminate both of their faces. "Wait for me to feed it," said Francis as he began to pull vines from the wall. Dan could see that Francis was a little distraught that removing the vines were making so much noise, however subtle. Francis tossed the vines onto the small fire, and suddenly it began to grow rapidly. Daniel saw that the flames were not actually white, but instead were like a film being projected. As this dancing window grew, he noted that the whiteness he saw was actually footage of a water's surf. The flames grew, and more details were revealed. This surf he saw was actually the wake of a man raising his head out of the water as he began to tread in place. Daniel instantly recognized this to be his father, Victor, only 20 years younger. "Witness now the moment of your conception," said Francis. "What?" cried Daniel. "It's not what you think," replied Francis. "It's here, in Eden." Daniel saw Victor gasp a little and quickly wipe the residual drops of water from his brow, while still maintaining to keep his head above water. "Like I said," started Francis, "it's here where your spirits come when two bodies are together." Daniel saw, through the flames, Victor start to swim to shore. He saw his old man find his footing and rise up along the banks of the spring from which he emerged. "My father," said Dan. "He told me when I saw him in the hospital that he had been to Eden." "Yes," replied Francis. "He wasn't meant to remember any of it. Keep watching." every sure step Victor took along the banks of the spring, he felt oddly familiar with his surroundings. His bare feet left prints in the mud, and the wild, distant calls of toucans and jaguars left prints in his mind. He felt an ecstatic sense of freedom and glee. It was almost as if he could enjoy the life of childhood as a fully grown man, and that this was some feral resort for a wicked summer vacation. He was, of course, unaware of the dangers, and he was blissfully unaware that Marie, his beloved wife of 6 months and the mother to his soon-to-be first and only child, had also arrived in Eden. Marie's admission was vastly different than that of Victor's. She did not emerge from some peaceful body of water. She came to Eden by falling, and her screams escaped her open mouth without the confines of sound. That was her first indication, before Harold, that she was no longer home. Dorothy wasn't in Kansas anymore, and Marie Livingston was far away from Buxton, Maine. Her long metamorphosis, which took place under the sky from which she currently fell, was that of fear, awe, longing, and then, finally, love. Harold was not a man. He was, in fact, a giant lizard on his way to the dark side of Eden. He had silently resolved to die. He was tired of eternity. He would march up the cliffside and join the others in their descent into the great void. His decision to die, while sudden, was not drastic. He simply believed that he had seen it all, and the decision that he made had come to him as subtle as the blossoming of a quiet rose. Perhaps if he was capable, at a more adequate level, regarding his own self-reflection, he would cite his brief love affair with a human 3 years earlier and her abrupt departure from his world. He did love her so, and wished to God for another. There was nothing particularly special about Harold in this world of the fantastique. He was not a handsome creature, even to his own species. He had a paunchy belly and thin arms. He walked with a slouch. He had extraordinarily bad breath. He was a chronic sneezer. He would often lounge lazily out in the sun, unlike the other creatures of Eden that yearned for shade under the lush foliage of tropical trees. Harold was perfectly content with being out in the open. Marie was content with her death. She figured, in this dreamlike state of hers, she would splatter against the ground and then wake up. She never in a million years anticipated being caught in the warm, soft arms of Harold. Screams were all that took place at first. Marie reached the extent of hysterics in a rhythmic exchange of looks between Harold and the world around her. There was an explosion in her mind. There was no way this was real. Harold just looked at her softly with indifferent eyes. "You know, I've been through this before," he said. "Just let me down," hollered Marie. "I've had enough of this." And indeed, she had. She had been falling and expecting to fall, and fall she did. The one thing she did not expect, beyond death, was to be caught by a homely-looking fellow. She expected death, almost welcomed it, but to be accepted by a Neanderthal such as this, a lizardy-looking creature? Harold let her slide from his arms. With 2 feet on the ground, she now stood. Her feet were firmly planted. "You can look around if you like," he said. "I don't need your permission," snapped Marie. "No, you don't." This was the first test to Harold's resolve against Marie's hysterics. Marie made no leeway with her righteous proclamation. She was too taken aback. She just looked around her for a moment before speaking again. "Who are you?" she asked. It was less of a question and more of an accusation. "I'm Harold," came the reply. "Where are we?" asked Marie. "You know, they all say that," said Harold, stopping a moment to pick his nose. "And you know what I tell them?" "What's that?" asked Marie. "We're all up your nose?" "No," smiled Harold. "Then what?" "I say we're at the center of your brain," responded Harold, "and that your brain does not belong to you. It was Harold now who started to look around and take in his surroundings, if only for show. "It's more of a loan." Marie said nothing. "The mind of God," muttered Harold as he let his voice trail off. "I don't know what that means," cried Marie. "It means that the sun is shining and you are here, and you might as well just enjoy being here, because—" Harold's lazy mind in the golden rays of sunshine began to evaporate, and his voice once again began to trail off. "What? Why?" "Because it's your brain, not mine." "Fuck," replied Marie. "Yes," said Harold, "why don't we?" Marie slapped him. The palm of her hand cracked Harold against his cheek, and it was very satisfying for her. It was the first time, since she landed with her feet on the ground, that she actually felt able to react to something, anything. "Do you honestly believe I would fuck something like you?" shouted Marie. "Now get me out of here." "I bet you $1,000 I want to leave this place more than you," said Harold. This stunned Marie. It puzzled her and put her off guard. "I was just on my way to go kill myself," said Harold casually. "Why?" asked Marie. "I've been here too long," was all that Harold could reply. "I've walked every inch of these forests. I've seen every animal, every leaf. In fact, I'm probably the only creature on this planet who has felt every inch of every golden sun ray, because the others don't like to be out here, away from the shade." He started walking, and Marie started to follow him. "And yet, God keeps dropping you women in my arms. He's tempting me." "Tempting you? Why?" asked Marie, with bitter skepticism. "Because he doesn't want me to leave," replied Harold. "He doesn't want me to join the dark side, to walk along the others and kill myself by stepping off into the great void." Marie heard this, and for the first time in this strange new land she contemplated. "I don't know," mused Harold, anticipating her next question. "Maybe it's because he knows I'm the only one who catches you fools when you fall out of the sky." "Where did I come from?" asked Marie, earnestly. This question puzzled even her until she grasped the fact that her arrival at this particular point in destination called into question everything she had ever known. "You came from the world of lovers," said Harold, "and this is where lovers go." Upon hearing this, Marie suddenly thought of Victor. "My husband?" she asked. "He is here also." "Where?" "I don't know," said Harold. He was disinterested in the subject of Victor, and he waved the question of Victor off lazily with a limp wrist. It was as if to say, "Don't ask any more questions about that." "He's around here somewhere," said Marie. She was determined. There was a tone to her voice now, and an aura about her. "Okay," Marie finally said. "So where are we going?" "Well, I'm just walking," said Harold. "And you're following me." "You're going to kill yourself?" asked Marie. "Yes," said Harold. "Up on the dark mountains." "I'll run away from you," declared Marie. Her footsteps already seemed a bit ahead of her, but she waited to be stopped. Harold just looked at her. He tried his best to convey an overwhelming sense of indifference, but there was a small part of him which would remain troubled at the thought of Marie out there in the jungle, all alone. "I'm the last of my kind," he finally said. It was a confession he hadn't dreamed of revealing to her. In fact, it was the first time that he had heard even himself speak the truth out loud. "I have been here for many years. You can look around this place. You won't see another like me." "I'll consider it a blessing," replied Marie, though she instantly felt sorry for her remark. It was a rather cruel thing to say to this beast, of whom she now gathered meant her no harm. After all, it did save her life. "Perhaps," muttered Harold. "I'm the last of the lizard men, just one of many of God's cruel jokes." He looked up to her once more with those black, penetrating eyes of his. It was then that she thought she saw something in there, a glint of sorts, and her body followed her in the decision to stay with him. Her feet no longer tingled and yearned to move. "Will you help me find my husband?" she finally asked. "Is he around here somewhere?" Yes, I'm sure he is. Will you help me? I mean, before you enter oblivion? Harold thought about her request for only a moment. If there's one thing about eternity that remains true, it's that oblivion waits for you always. Is that a yes? Asked Marie. She was eyeing him coyly now. It was a look more of curiosity than flirtation. Yes, it's a yes, said Harold. And again the two of them began walking. Their proportions were extreme, as Harold towered over her by at least 3 feet. Victor was having the time of his life. Thoughts of the reality that he had left behind when he surfaced from that spring were quickly fading as he raced through the jungle. The more he challenged himself, the faster he ran, gracefully dodging any twig or rock that might cut the bottom of his feet. His body felt empty, save for the fact that just beneath the surface of his skin he felt more alive and electric than ever before. He was like a hollow rock that glowed with a geothermal heat. Sir Peter Francis remained bound to the granite altar. His wrists were scraped by the rough twine used. He had all but given up hope. He knew it was only a matter of time before the great big one had returned to eat him. He had watched it, like the others, grow throughout the centuries, and all of his thoughts were drained now, and all that was left was the grim sensation that soon death would return to feast. Francis saw only feet in an instant until his brain could catch up with his perception and note that a man had just effortlessly jumped over not only him but the entire altar in a mighty sprint. When Victor landed, he let his momentum roll off of him to the ground as he turned and looked at Francis. Francis seemed just as shocked to witness Victor's feat as Victor was to see Francis crouched down and bound. "Who are you?" demanded Victor. "I'm nobody," replied Francis. "Are you a criminal?" "No." "Then why are you tied to that granite?" "I'm a meal." "You're a what?" "Yes," replied Francis. "For the great big one, I'm a meal, and you're an outsider." "I belong here now," said Victor proudly. "Why?" asked Francis. "Do you think just because you can run through the jungle that you somehow own it?" Victor contemplated this accusing question with some newfound humility. "Trust me," added Francis, "this place is no playground." "Why you?" asked Victor. "What? Out of all the creatures here under the sun, why eat something like you?" "Because I told you, I'm nobody. I'm neutral. You understand?" "No." "I have no partner, no equal. He can eat me without upsetting another one." Francis wiped the sweat from his brow and looked once more up at the sun. Victor followed his gaze. "Is that where it will come from? The sky?" No, Francis quickly answered. "It's down here, amongst us. I was just wondering." "Wondering what?" "Why it is you who stopped here to talk with me." "Maybe I'm just hungry," replied Victor with a sternness in his voice. Francis laughed. He began to chuckle at first, but soon he was full on laughing. It got to the point where Victor couldn't help but laugh too. He had let his guard down and instantly found kinship with the stranger. Victor walked over to Francis and he found a sharp rock just out of reach of the old man. He began to cut the ropes that held the stranger. "I owe you my life," professed Francis. "Save it," said Victor. Victor did not need to be thanked for such a small task. In all actuality, it had kind of taken him aback to his days serving in the Vietnam War, and he was thankful for the chance to be somebody's hero once more. "No," said Francis, "you saved it." The gratitude began to overwhelm Victor, and he felt uncomfortable being coated with this appreciation. "I'm going this way," said Victor, pointing with his finger. He was hoping Francis wouldn't join him. "Are you looking for her?" "Who?" asked Victor. "Your wife," replied Francis. Victor felt embarrassed and ashamed that he had almost forgotten entirely about her. "How'd you know I was married?" asked Victor. "Most people are," said Francis. "It's still the 20th century, isn't it?" he asked. Victor seemed a bit put off by Sir Peter Francis' genuine curiosity. "Why?" he asked. "What year is it here?" "I don't know," muttered Francis. "Space, time, those are all big questions." "You're being cryptic," said Victor. "Yes, I am," replied Francis, almost defiant. "Why?" "Because the less you know, the less likely you are to cause trouble." Francis was serious when he said this. "You'll be gone in an instant anyway." "Gone in an instant?" "Well, your time, that is." Upon hearing this, Victor looked around him. He looked high up into the treetops that surrounded them with wide eyes. "I'm in Eden, aren't I?" he asked. The question was delivered almost as if he was talking to himself. "Yes, you are," answered Francis. "Yeah, well," started Victor. He seemed distracted. "You seem to know more than I do." Victor was hoping that Francis might anticipate his request, that is, to join Victor. "Come on," he said, "let's go." And with that, Victor started off. He continued into that vast, thick, and lush jungle, and Francis followed him. Victor swatted at the thicket in front of him. He made a point to keep a slow pace. He was sure that the deteriorated Francis could follow. Marie sat comfortably along the banks of the babbling brook. Her hands were planted behind her and allowed her to lean her shoulders and head back. Harold was closer to the water. He was squatting low, his hands ready to pounce, and his eyes focused keenly upon a small, unsuspecting trout that swam just below the surface of the water. That is, he tried intently not to notice how beautiful Marie looked in her light blue see-through dress. It reminded Harold of the sky. He instantly decided to look up, foolishly hoping to avert his thoughts somehow. But no, it was of course all wrong. The sky only reminded him of her dress. Thankfully, Harold was able to accomplish what he set out to do. As the small trout swam closer, he quickly grabbed it and yanked it out of the water. He held it high as if he was going to eat it. At least this is what Marie thought, being only mildly interested in Harold's actions at the time. To her amazement, the trout started talking. "Oh, Harold," said the trout, breathing a sigh of relief. "Thank God it's only you. You nearly scared me half to death, you know." "Sorry about that," replied Harold. "Listen, my friend here—" Harold looked back at Marie to see if she objected to Harold's timid proclamation of friendship. She didn't. She seemed distracted, taking in all the sights and sounds of this peaceful atmosphere. "Is looking for somebody," continued Harold. "Her husband. I figured he might have come up through the spring." "What's he look like?" asked the trout. Harold, not knowing this, turned again to Marie and let her answer. "He has a beard," she said. "A beard? A beard, huh? Yeah, I bet I saw him a little while ago. Looked like he was headed east," replied the trout. "East?" asked Harold to confirm. "That's right." "Thanks," said Harold. "No problem. But hey, before you put me down, could you, you know," asked the trout. And Harold did know. He smiled a bit before lifting the trout high into the air. The trout gave a loud whistle, as if it was hailing a cab. "Hey, Ma!" he shouted. A large, colorful bird in a tall tree began to rustle and take notice. "Yeah, Ma, it's really me. Listen, the wife and kids are all good. Everything's good down here, okay?" The bird, as if hearing what it wanted to hear, spread its wings and flew off into the sky. "She still don't speak English?" the trout asked Harold. Harold shook his head no. "Huh, how about that?" "I'll be seeing you," said Harold. "Yeah, all right," replied the trout, understanding that it was time to be thrown back into the water. Harold let his friend go and watched the little fellow swim away. Marie got to her feet and approached Harold from behind. "I don't understand." Replied Harold. "Oh, yeah, he thinks the bird that ate his mother still has her inside of it. He's been trying to communicate with it for as long as I've known him." "What a bizarre idea," replied Marie. "Yeah, well, let's go find your husband, shall we?" Marie and Harold began to walk, and they walked and they walked and they walked, what slowly began to feel like hours to Marie. Their lack of conversation began to become a noticeable nuisance. Perhaps the real nuisance was that they both had very little to say to one another. And this is how it would have remained had Marie not seen the most beautiful flower she had ever seen in her life. It was bright orange, and it had a blossom the size of a large pineapple. "Look at that," she said. Harold stopped dead in his tracks and turned to see. "Yeah?" he replied. Marie was examining it closer now. She lifted it up slightly with her fingertips. "What's it called?" she asked. "A flower," replied Harold. "No, but I mean, what is its name?" "A name? We don't name flowers here." "Why not?" was Marie's almost immediate response. Harold thought about this a long moment. Like Marie, he began to gently examine the blossom, feeling comfortably alone with his thoughts, and yet an odd awareness of his companion was still present. "We could name this one Marie's flower," he finally said, and with that, he picked it from its stem and handed it to her. Marie accepted the gift graciously, but was also silent. She was unsure what to think of this towering lizard man who stood before her. It was all at once that she recalled the tale told to her in her youth about a frog prince. And this was it. She was almost sure of it. Though she wanted to like him, there was something about him, something soft. As she looked into his black eyes and his round face, this softness became more and more undeniable. "Thank you," she said, and she leaned forward with her head up and wrapped her arms around Harold's wet and slippery body. Harold leaned down and kissed her forehead. To his amazement, she did not recoil in terror. "Do you still feel like you're the last of your kind?" asked Marie innocently. No, I suppose not, sighed Harold. Marie and Harold tramped through the forest until they came across the stone altar. Harold parted a bushel of leaves to see it there, abandoned. He cautiously walked around it with Marie in tow. On the other side he noticed the severed twine. "What is it?" asked Marie. "It looks as though someone escaped." "Escaped? From who?" "From the great big one." "The great big what?" asked Marie. "Snake," answered Harold. There was a dark tone in his voice now, as if he meant to warn Marie by instilling an ounce of fear in her. "It's hungry, and it must eat." Harold knelt down and examined the two sets of footprints that still remained freshly placed in the soft soil below them. They led off, and judging by their placement and depth, Harold deduced that the two were in a hurry. He looked back to the altar and saw that only one had been bound. Of course, heroics are not uncommon in these parts. Eden will bring out the best and the worst in you humans. "Heroics?" asked Marie. "Then it must be my husband. He is twice decorated." "Yes, perhaps," said Harold, a little self-consciously. "Can we follow them?" "I'm an excellent tracker," professed Harold, and with that they did. They spent the remainder of the hour paying close attention to the ground as they walked. They had walked nearly 5 miles before Harold began to steer the conversation to matters that more interested him. "You know," he started casually, as Marie followed him in the subtle trail he made of parted branches, "our time, our place, is a lot different than yours." "Yeah, I guess," said Marie. She was getting a little tired from all this hiking. "The things people do here, they never remember them. This isn't their reality." "Yeah." Marie was barely paying attention to Harold, but at that particular point in time, she was okay with the idea of conversation. "We're much more about love in this place than you are in yours." "I don't know if that's necessarily true," replied Marie. She understood now that Harold was hitting on her. "I think it is," he said. "Have you been to our time, our place?" "No," said Harold thoughtfully, "but I have met many women who have." Marie did not let on that she was surprised to hear this. She thought she was the first human Harold had ever met. She started to suspect that Harold fancied himself a bit of a ladies' man. "And they've all told me," Harold continued. "Told you what?" asked Marie. She was a bit more defensive now. "I don't know," Harold shrugged. "That the men in your time and place are just a bit different, that's all." "I think men are the same all over," snapped Marie, "and if you think anything's going to happen between the two of us, you're sorely mistaken." Harold stopped dead in his tracks. He turned and leered at Marie. It was the first time she had ever looked at him and saw even the slightest hint of malice. "I'm your friend," Harold said, and with that he started walking again as Marie cautiously continued to follow him. "And if you want me to help you find your husband," Harold trailed off. "You are helping me find my husband," said Marie, "right now." "Yeah, well, I might only be able to take you so far. The forest is so big, and I've got other things that I want to be doing too, you know." "You mean like killing yourself?" asked Marie bitterly. "Well, if I did, where would that leave you?" said Harold. Marie stopped. She stood up straight and perfectly still and waited for Harold to turn around. This was not the frog prince she had hoped for. This was the startling realization that the cruel, stark, jagged edge of reality could follow her, even in her dreams. "All right," she said. Effortlessly, she dropped her thin gown. Harold just looked at her, the stern expression on her face, the rigid configuration of her body. "I don't want it like this," he said. "You'll take it any way I give it to you," said Marie. "Let's just get this over with." Stubbornly, she laid back down at the base of a large tree trunk. Seeing her there, Harold felt compelled beyond his morals. He slowly approached her, half expecting to be suddenly attacked with a nearby stone or something. As he hovered over her, Marie recognized that boyish charm that she had seen in Harold before, but now she instantly hated it. It took every fiber in her being not to lash out and rip his stupid face off. "When this is over, I don't ever want to see your ugly face again," she snapped. It was not something she meant to say. It was something that just blurted out of her. She saw a touch of sadness in his eyes, and she hated him even more. "How will I show you the way?" he asked, heartbroken. "You'll travel on up ahead and leave markers for me to follow." Marie was a bit amazed at how quick on her feet she could think and problem solve at that moment. Harold silently agreed to this. Harold was perched on the highest tree branch of the tallest tree, and he watched Marie make her way through the thicket far below. His regret was immeasurable, and he was so grateful that Marie was blissfully unaware of him overseeing her through her journey. He had done what she had asked, and had quickly traveled ahead. He found Victor and Francis in a clearing about a mile ahead of her. He did not make his presence known to them or say anything. Instead, he gathered up all the bright orange flowers he could find, Marie's flowers, and placed them by the footprints of Victor that led back to where Marie walked. He watched her travel with sorrow and torment. He hated himself for being such a monster, but a monster is what he was. With every orange flower that Marie would find, she would pick it up, crumble it in her hands, and bitterly toss it out into the bushes. She saw a clearing up ahead, and she heard faint voices. She did not bother to pick up that last flower because the sight she came upon was so welcoming that all of her thoughts escaped her, and her emotions reigned supreme. It was Victor, standing there with a stranger. She did not care about the stranger. She only cared about Victor. He was surprised to see her, and there was no way his enthusiasm could match that of Marie's. "Victor!" she cried out loud, and raced toward him with open arms. Francis, who stood by Victor's side, seemed deeply disturbed by her very loud entrance into the clearing. "Quiet, my dear," snapped Francis. "We're being stalked." Upon hearing this, Marie froze. Victor held out his hand towards Marie, but it was not to invite her, but to keep her at a safe distance. "His name is Harold," whispered Marie. "Who?" asked Francis. "The monster," replied Marie. "No," said Francis. "His name is—" Suddenly, they began to hear a large rumble, as if giant boulders were moving. "He's coming!" shouted Francis. From the trees emerged the source of all that rumbling and disbursement. It was the largest snake that both Victor and Marie had ever seen, the length of 2 18-wheelers and the girth of a small compact car. It moved with an extraordinary amount of speed and grace, yet upon the clearing it stopped and prepared itself to pounce. "There's no hope!" cried Francis. The three of them seemed doomed. Suddenly, Harold flew to the ground from the highest branch of the tallest tree in the area. Upon landing, he shattered the bone in his right leg. It stuck out like a jagged stick just below his knee, and he groaned in enormous pain. "Marie," he said, "get out of here." Marie and the others did not need a second plea. They fled into the nearby forest and watched as Harold picked up a nearby tree branch that had joined Harold in his rapid and impulsive descent to the ground. Harold now wielded it as a weapon to ward off the monster. Given the size of the great beast that stood before him, Harold's battle stance seemed utterly pathetic. The snake, with a poorly shaded sense of glee, lunged towards Harold. Harold gave it his best strike with the impromptu weapon he held, a strike so strong and intense that it would knock any man into the next century, yet it only grazed the jaw of the snake as it quickly snatched him up off the ground. Harold felt every bone in his body break in the vicious attack and yelped out in one last dying plea before his body was devoured entirely. In the bushes where Marie hid, she reached out and grasped that last orange flower. Dan felt himself being violently shaken, and his senses quickly began to return. He was back inside the cave now, and he heard a loud rumbling. Francis had a stern grip on his shirt collar, and he kept yanking and pulling on it to get Dan's attention. "Daniel," he cried. "Daniel! We must go. We must run." Francis could not wait any longer. Fear had gotten the better of him. He left Dan recovering and headed straight down the dark corridors ahead of them. Daniel could see a little bit better now. Francis had left behind a lit torch which illuminated the small area in which Daniel stood. He retrieved the torch and began to wield it only to find the large head of a giant snake peering right at him. He quickly realized that these tunnels were the home of this giant beast. Daniel froze with fear at the startling realization that yes, he was indeed in Eden, because here before him was the snake. The snake's eyes sparkled a bit from the firelight of Daniel's torch, and Daniel got the inexplicable feeling that it was reading his mind. "Yes," said the snake, confirming the fact that this was Eden, and he was the snake. But Daniel had never seen the snake depicted before as being so giant. "I have grown," answered the snake. Who are you?" stuttered Dan. "My name is Alexander," hissed the snake in its dark and foreboding tone. "What do you want?" asked Daniel. "Look into my eyes," answered Alexander. "Look into my eyes." Daniel couldn't help but do so. He suddenly began to feel very lightheaded. He felt his mind slowly drift away. Daniel found himself back in his bedroom facing Theresa. He was kneeling beside the dying monster that lay on the floor. He now recognized it to be the illegitimate offspring of Harold's and his own half-brother. He knew now, too, that Theresa's mother had also had an affair with Harold, and that this was the product of that as well. This knowledge came to him miraculously because it was known by the snake. Daniel did not feel in control of himself, though. He felt like a tourist in his own mind. He could hear the words coming out of his mouth, but they were not his. He understood now that the snake had possessed him, and he was powerless to do anything about it. He could not cry out or warn Theresa that this was happening to him. "Tell me the story of how we first met," Daniel heard himself say. It was terrifying having Alexander speak through him, but then something occurred to him. How did he know about Theresa's mother? He could share thoughts with this horrible beast, and it had no control over Daniel's presence in its mind. Daniel began to concentrate as hard as he could. Why was the snake so interested in the day he and Theresa had met? It suddenly occurred to him as miraculously as the knowledge of Theresa's mother. The snake was desperate to understand the nature of fate. Back in the cave now, the snake hissed violently at Dan. "Yes," said Dan. He was in control now. "Get out of my head," hissed the snake. "No," shouted Dan. "Never." Daniel continued to concentrate as he navigated the thoughts of Alexander. He felt like a god. The power was almost too intoxicating for him to handle. Why was this monster so interested in the nature of fate? The answer came to him. It was because Alexander the snake wanted to reverse fate. But why? Again, the answer came to him. The snake was destined to burrow its way through this great mountain of Eden and fall into the pit of oblivion. It knew this. Alexander knew this. "Silence!" shouted the snake. Daniel now saw. He saw why the creatures of Eden were marching into the pit, killing themselves because they had lost their mates. The snake was trying to fill that great pit of oblivion up with their dead bodies. It would try and convince them all. It would get inside their heads and ravage their thoughts with devastating statements of love lost. Daniel suddenly felt a burst of energy blast his mind from the furious snake, and again he found himself back in the bedroom facing Theresa. "Tell me about the day you first met Daniel," he heard himself say to Theresa. "Kill him," thought Daniel. "I'm not telling you shit," said Theresa. "Yes," thought Daniel. "Now kill him, kill him." Daniel focused on these thoughts as hard as he could in hopes that he might be able to get his mouth to utter them. A hopeless feeling suddenly came over him. Theresa would never kill something that she thought was Daniel, and this creature, this semblance, looked like Daniel and spoke with Daniel's voice. His only hope for Theresa to stab the snake Alexander with her knife was dwindling. He knew that she would never gamble in this way. Daniel could see through the eyes that were possessed by Alexander, a look of fear and uncertainty on Theresa's face. And then suddenly it occurred to him. Fire. Fire, he thought. Fire. Swiftly Dan found himself back in the cave with the torch lit and in his hand. With all of his might and will, he shoved the flame towards the snake's big eyes. It shuddered in flints, retreating itself. "Yes," said Dan, "that's it." He shoved the flame towards it once more. Dan now had the presence of mind to run, and run he did. He headed out quickly down the dark cavern that Sir Francis had taken. He ran like the wind. He ran like the wind in a windstorm. His legs pulsed with every stride, the strength of 1,000 horses. And it was all in the dark. At any given moment, Daniel could have collided with a wall, yet he didn't care. Daniel saw the light at the end of the tunnel, both figuratively and literally. The welcome sight of the jungle leaves made themselves apparent in the distant sunlight. Daniel ran and eventually exited the tunnel into the open air. He braced himself off of his kneecaps, panting, not out of necessity so much as habit. He turned to one side, his right, and found Sir Peter Francis sitting and leaning up against the stone wall. The old man clearly looked upset. "You left me," sneered Daniel with a growing anger. "You left me in there with that thing." "I'm sorry," pleaded Francis. He was completely at the mercy of Daniel. "I'm sorry, but Alexander is after me. He's been hunting me for years, centuries even. I don't know." Daniel approached Francis, reached down, got a hold of his old cloak, and yanked him to his feet. He shoved the old man against the stone that stood behind them. "That thing entered my mind," cried Daniel. "It's in my bedroom with Theresa right now." No, stuttered Francis. "It can't be there because you escaped its gaze." "I remember you now," said Daniel. "I remember you from my dreams. You placed the beast under my bed." Daniel succumbed to a manic fit of furious rage and shook Francis once more. "When I was just a child," he shouted. I had to," stuttered Francis, and he began to break down and weep in a spell of weak and defeated tears. It was odd, as Daniel observed the old man collapse his usual demeanor, to see him now so vulnerable. "What do you mean you had to?" asked Daniel. "The creature," started Francis. "It could not stay here." "Why not?" Francis violently grabbed Dan's collar and shoved him against the stone wall behind them. "Because we have laws," he cried. "It was fate. It had to be raised by the two of you. Your love would not deny the passion of your mothers." Francis looked around feverishly. knowing full well that they could not stay where they were. He looked for a place to run, but Daniel stopped him with an equally firm grip. Francis could see that Daniel was about to speak, but he cut him off. "We had hoped you would not raise it with fear, but you did. And whose fault is that?" "Fear?" asked Daniel. "Yes," replied Francis. "Your fear of commitment, or whatever." Francis refused the stubbornness of Daniel's stance. They could not stay there any longer. "Now come on," he shouted. "We must go." Francis yanked Daniel into joining him in his running stride as the rumbling of Alexander's body echoed through the innermost chambers of the underground tunnels. Alexander was after them. The jungle became a flurry of sights and sounds as Daniel and Francis raced, their steps merely skimming the fertile surface of the area they covered. They returned to the golden field that Daniel had fled oh so long ago, but the black tent was no longer there. Daniel was surprised to see it missing, but Francis did not seem worried. He kept leading Daniel to the center of the field until they saw others in monk robes rise up from the tall grass. They were neutrals, like Francis. Without saying a word, they slowly circled Dan and Francis and held hands. "This is it," said Francis to Daniel. "I'm never going to see you again," said Daniel. Neither he nor Francis could decipher whether or not there was solace in this statement or spite. "You will see me again," said Francis. "You will see me again and again, but you won't remember any of it." Daniel put a friendly hand on Francis's shoulder. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome," said Francis, and with that he closed his eyes, as did all the other monk figures in the circle. "We do not see you," said Francis. "We do not see you." Suddenly it became a chant in which the others joined in. "We do not see you. We do not see you. We do not see you." Francis opened his eyes, and Daniel saw that they were completely black. It was startling. He looked around and saw that all the other monks were sporting black eyes as well. It was the last thing Daniel saw. It was the last thing he remembered. "45. Theresa watched as the semblance of Dan vanished into thin air before her very eyes. She had the horrible thought that perhaps this would be the last time that she would ever see him at all. Daniel, that is. Her rational mind could distinguish the semblance of Dan from the actual person, yet still her heart and eyes pleaded against that slight chance. In the moment, her love for him was desperate, and that desperation, needless or not, poorly masked her horrible fear. Dan awoke on his hardwood floor under the mattress. He felt smothered by its softness. He struggled to move. The weight of the clock was heavy. He managed to roll and shift and use a bit of leverage to get most of the clock off of him so he could slide out into the light of the bedroom. He saw Theresa standing there. Her eyes were wide open and distant. Shock had devoured her body and senses. He watched her only for a moment, contemplating what he could possibly say to her. He could not begin to describe to her what he had just experienced. He was smart enough to know this, at least. But she was still frozen, and so something had to be said. It was her name that could call her attention, and so he spoke her name. "Theresa," he said softly, but there was no reaction. "Theresa," his voice was louder now. Still she did not move. Daniel thought of his position. He was now under the bed, though it was less of a bed, per se, and more of a disheveled mattress. Regardless, he was now in the place from which such great torment had resided a short time ago. Through the entirety of Dan's life, he had reserved one simple tactic for breaking the ice, and so now, even in these dramatic circumstances, he opted to try his hand at a sense of humor. His wit proved to be a step ahead of his thought process, and so he spoke without even thinking. "Here lies the loneliest man on earth," he said. He managed a dry smirk as he waited for her response, but in his head he was asking his wit why it would say such a thing. It quickly occurred to him. Theresa had mentioned that she had once kept the etching from a tombstone that bared that particular saying under her mattress. Though his quip may have been witty, it was certainly not funny, at least not to Theresa, and Daniel strained to think why he thought it would be. He knew full well that she never favored the dark side of his sense of humor. Theresa slowly looked up from the floor to Daniel, and at first her expression did not change. Daniel wasn't entirely sure if she had heard him or not, given the complete lack of countenance she relinquished. She made no physical effort towards him. "Are you real?" she finally asked cautiously. "I'm as real as I'm ever gonna be," said Daniel. He was able to completely free himself now from the forced shelter of the mattress. He managed to get to his feet and stand tall. He wanted to hug her, but he saw that she still held the knife in her hand. He took the calculated risk to just stand there and wait for her to really see him. He saw now that small tears were beginning to stream down her face. "Is it over?" she asked. "The monster's dead, that thing we were dealing with. But I don't think it's ever really over." "Where did you go?" she asked. "You left me here all alone with it, with that thing." "I was with you towards the end," said Dan, dusting himself off. "And I really want to hold you now. Will you just let me hold you?" Theresa laughed joyously, but it only added more turmoil to the appearance of her face. "Yes," she answered, and begged at the same time. "Will you drop the knife?" Daniel asked. Theresa did so. It stuck into the floor as she rushed up to Daniel in a flurry of relief and exhaustion. She threw her arms around him and squeezed. She did not let go. Nothing could make her let go, and Dan felt as safe in her arms as she did in his. They did it. They survived it. Whatever it was, exactly, was still unclear to Theresa, but none of that mattered now. All that she knew was that, thankfully, things had become resolved. "46. Dan sat at the kitchen table with his hands interlaced and his chin resting thoughtfully. Theresa was waiting, and he knew this. She was waiting for him to try and communicate what he wasn't telling her. There was a kettle on the stovetop, and the water was beginning to boil. Theresa was manning it while she would sporadically glance over at Dan. "Say something," she demanded. "What?" asked Daniel. "Say something." "Why?" asked Daniel, defensively. He was self-conscious at that moment, and could not see clearly that an explanation was needed. He did vanish underneath that toppled-over mattress. "Because one of us has to say something," said Theresa, and with that, Daniel just let the words spill right out of him. Man never questions pleasure, he said, not bothering to clarify. Pleasure? Asked Theresa. Pleasure? If he were to do this, he would quickly learn not to trust the orgasm, said Daniel. He felt the words of Francis almost travel through him. Orgasm? Theresa was not in the least bit satisfied, to any extent, of Daniel's response. Daniel, she said, making herself sarcastically patient before Daniel would finally give her his eye contact. When he did so, she felt nothing but sympathy, and her tone quickly changed. Come back to me, she said. She needed the man she loved to start making sense again. What just happened? The creature, that thing, started Daniel. It belonged to both of us. The sensitive tone in his voice was a little bewildering to Theresa. A half-brother, he added. Theresa felt beaten down by the prospect of living the rest of her life with Daniel and never having anything more, in regards to the events that unfolded, than the vague conversation she was currently experiencing. Daniel, she said, I'm leaving you if you don't tell me everything. Daniel looked up at her from the table. I'm serious, she said, and she was. I don't want to share this mystery with anyone. Not with you, not with anyone. So unless it's solved, I'm walking out that door right now and you won't ever see me again. I'll live alone. I don't want you to be alone, said Daniel. Okay, she said. She knew she was getting somewhere with him now. She grabbed the old papers she had stashed on top of the refrigerator and tossed them down on the table in front of Daniel. They were the papers that Bartholomew had given them. They were the papers that Dmitri had stolen from them. They were the papers that Victor had written. You can start with this, said Theresa. Daniel began to leaf through the pages half-heartedly. He already knew the secrets they contained, but he felt obligated to pretend to read them. When two bodies combine their spirits, they are lifted to a higher plane, another world. They must never remember their journeys through this world, and so things must be forgotten. But if we are to lose our memories, then pleasure must replace them, so we do not question their absence. Sir Peter Francis. Daniel took the pages containing Peter's quotation and calmly handed it to Theresa. When I was gone, he started, feeling the silence between them. When you thought that I had left you, well, I had. I was taken by that man to a place where everyone goes at one time or another. Eden, said Theresa. Yes, replied Daniel. He wasn't sure if he was more shocked that she had guessed it or that she was listening to him, for when he attempted to recall the events that unfolded, he felt distant even in his own mind. I witnessed a journey taken by both of my parents and a love affair that occurred between my mother and a monster. A monster who just so happened to have been with your mother as well, and Eden. How is it that you know this? Asked Theresa. Or rather, how is it that you saw this? Daniel seemed to ignore Theresa's inquiries as he continued to speak. The creature under our bed, that thing, was the result of both of our mothers. What? Time is different there. It isn't exactly strictly linear, which is why, I think, it's governed more by lust. No, Daniel, interrupted Theresa. How can two mothers have the same child? She asked. That creature there appeared to be only one. Yes, I know, said Daniel. That's what I mean, time and the universe. Look, it's difficult for me to explain because I, myself, can't understand everything. Try, said Theresa. Try harder. I'm listening. It was fate that brought the two of us together, and that thing you were talking to when you thought it was me, well, I was there, but it wasn't me. What was it? It was a big giant snake, said Daniel. He nearly wept from the absurdity of it all. Talking about it out loud did not seem to be vacating all of the exhaustion and turmoil he felt. What did it want from me? It was looking for some kind of clue about the nature of fate or destiny or whatever. That's why it was asking you about the time we first met. Dan was surprised to see that Theresa had suddenly realized something. What do you remember about that day? I mean, regarding whatever, us. The flowers, said Theresa. No, she suddenly corrected herself. Not the flowers. It wasn't the flowers. It was the last two lovers on earth. What? Asked Daniel. Perhaps they're the key. Perhaps they walk amongst us. If there really was and is an Adam and Eve, then why wouldn't there be... if there were the first lovers on earth, why wouldn't there be the last lovers on earth? Perhaps they walk among us in all times. Suddenly there was a knock at the door. It froze both Dan and Theresa in a startled state, until finally one of them spoke. Should we answer it? Asked Theresa. I will, said Dan, and he got up from the table. He walked through the living room and answered the door. There stood, waiting, was Sheriff Jack Friedman, with a bandaged woman by his side. Dan could not see her face with all of the bandages, and she wore a long brown trench coat. He thought she looked a little bit like the Invisible Man, but he knew who she really was. He just sensed that it was the psychic Diane. She insisted on coming here, said Jack. It took great efforts to smuggle her out of the burn victims' ward. Dan just stood there in front of the two lovers. I broke the law in assisting her, continued Jack. The laws, said Daniel, as he thought of his farewell from Francis. There are just too many to count. Jack smiled a little upon hearing this. Yeah, I guess you're right, he said. Diane reached into her pocket and retrieved Dan's engagement ring, meant for Theresa. She slowly handed it over to Dan. Take it, she whispered through thin, burnt lips. What happened to you? Asked Dan. There was an intervention, replied Jack. Do you want to come in? Asked Dan. No, answered Jack. We have to get back. He looked to Diane. We have to get back, and we have to heal, and then we have to live out our lives together, all over again, he said. It was a cryptic remark, that last part. Dan thought about it briefly, and what Theresa had said to him about the day they first met. His mind was interrupted when Jack continued. In love, he added. Okay, then, said Dan. Goodbye, said Diane. I saw your son, said Dan. The other one, I mean. He's free now, she whispered, and with that she reached over and closed the door on Jack and herself. Dan stood there a moment, flabbergasted. He looked at the ring and put it in his pocket. Who was it? He heard Theresa ask from the kitchen. Nobody, replied Dan, on his way back to the kitchen. He crossed the living room floor, but not before stopping briefly to stare up at the bullet holes in the ceiling. He imagined eyes peering through and watching him. He knew that this was now only his imagination, because he could see the intent behind his thoughts. Daniel recognized a guilty conscience when he felt one. No, that's not true, he said. Oh? It was the oddest thing, said Daniel. It was the sheriff and the gypsy, and they were together. The sheriff? Theresa was puzzled. Yes, said Daniel, and the gypsy. What did they want? Asked Theresa. Daniel now understood his instinct to lie after the front door had closed. He felt a fear in the pit of his stomach. Now was not the time. He could not present the ring to her at this time. His thoughts stuttered, and he struggled to speak another lie. They wanted to say we made it, he finally said calmly. Daniel entered the kitchen, and inexplicably, Theresa greeted him with a hug and a kiss on the lips. She laughed a little in playful fashion. What did they say really? She asked. I'll tell you later, replied Daniel. He casually looked down at the stack of papers that were now spread out across the table, and read out of the corner of his eye. Dear Daniel, my son, my confession to you is that at the moment of your conception, I wasn't really there. There was another. I know you will not understand these remarks, or at least I pray you never will, but know that your mother was never unfaithful to me. He let his body fall into the nearest chair at the kitchen table. The water for tea began to boil and let out a screech. Theresa quickly attended to it. She poured herself a glass, and she poured one for Dan. Some of these documents look pretty old, said Theresa, interrupting Dan's reading and taking a seat next to him at the table. As old as time itself, replied Dan, solemnly. Dan thought to clarify. At least, that's how they look. And monsters are real, said Theresa, as she began to sift through a few of the pages that weren't in front of Dan. We know that now. She froze her body and looked at Dan. She let her eyes do the talking. She was serious now. Yeah, Dan replied. Many different kinds, I suppose. Monsters of Eden? Asked Theresa. Who knows? The evening had come, but the sky was not yet dark. The last yawning fingers of the sun's golden rays were fading across the bed of blue and gray in the endless heavens. Dan and Theresa sat on a bench made from a thick pine tree in their backyard. It was not unlike that piece of driftwood upon which they sat the day they first met, roughly the same size. They watched the bonfire before them. Dan put his arm around Theresa's shoulders. She let her head flop over onto him, and the two of them sat there in silence. The mattress that had sheltered that once horrible beast was now engulfed in the warm flames of a peaceful goodbye. For Dan, it was a commitment that he would never consciously go back to Eden, at least not without the accompaniment of Theresa. This was a good idea, said Theresa. I agree, said Dan. They were together on that bench, before that fire, and they had never felt more assured. There was an old gray radio turned off and put to one side. It was small, and the manufacturing even predated an audiocassette standard. It was good to pick up a few local stations on those nights that Dan and Theresa had shared in the past, sitting by the fire and talking, and tossing back a couple of cold ones. Theresa turned Dan to face her with gentle persuasion. She kissed him softly, as if it were for the first time, and in a way it was. This was the eve of their new lives. That was nice, said Dan. Theresa got up from the bench and laid down on the cool and damp grass. The grass is wet, she noted. My shirt. Dan followed suit and joined her on the ground. He kissed her jawline as he arranged himself next to her. Theresa removed her wet shirt. She nodded to the leather jumpsuit which now burned in the fire with the mattress. No more thick skin, she said coyly. That's all right, said Dan, and he moved on top of her. His fingers spread from the palm of his hand, and they formed her breast like clay. Their lips docked in the soft, fleshy lock of a hungry quiver. Dan, she mused, yes, don't forget to, well, you know. I don't want to lose you to the wondrous sights of wherever it is our spirits go. I promise, said Dan. I won't remember any of it. He smiled, and they kissed once more. Lit by the fire, their naked bodies pulsed as one. Theresa's tiny fingers held the broad back of Dan as they journeyed into the thick throes of passion. That night, in the early hours before dawn, Dan took Theresa's sleeping body and held it close to him. He wondered what she must have been dreaming and hoped that it was pleasant. He gently took her limp hand and slid the engagement ring onto it. The old radio that rested off to one side was playing softly. Tom Petty's "I Won't Back Down" came through the speakers. And by the time Theresa had awakened at dawn, Dan had drifted to his much-needed slumber. She noticed the ring on her hand. With her head on his chest, she felt comfortable. This has been a reading of Under the Bed by Josiah Miles Pitchforth. It was read by the author. For more information about the author and his work, please visit www.josiahmilespitchforth.com.